Hey, how's it going? Uh, Ross Thatcher here with another reading for you today. I've had a little gardening incident this morning where I totally squashed my finger. It's kind of a little bit swollen up and very, very painful. I dropped about a 50 kilogram rock onto it. Of course, accidentally. I don't think anybody does something like that deliberately. It's getting better. Of course, I had to downplay it at the time and pretend it didn't hurt. After about an hour or so, it just got so painful. I haven't been self-medicating actually. I've been quite well behaved, and to sit down and read the second part of this book, as we know is Secret of the Ages, I've decided that it's probably time I did start self-medicating. And this ice pack is just about melted now. It's not doing much for me. So I've poured myself just a wee glass of port. So cheers, folks. Very nice indeed. It's only $5 a bottle at Audi. Can you believe that? How cheap it is. So as we know, this book is called Secret of the Ages by Brinsley Le Poer Trench. I should have turned the light on before I started. So I'm just going to go and do that, or not. I shan't. I'm up to part 2 now, which is called The Case for a Hollow Earth. And because my bookmark is a bottle opener, it's probably quite appropriate that I bottle opened, because man cannot live on port alone. So cheers once again. Not bad, not bad. So the case for the Hollow Earth begins with Part 9, Legends of the Inner World. In my first book, The Sky People, the original Garden of Eden was placed on another planet. You will recall that after the fall, Adam was expelled from Eden. Therefore the Lord God sent him forth from the Garden of Eden to till the ground from whence he was taken. Genesis 3:23. Italics, put in by the author, was from whence he was taken. Now, myself personally, of course, I do not believe in other planets whatsoever. I do believe there could be other continents, and I do believe that what we think of as the North Pole is perhaps something far, far different than what we are told by conventional standards today it is. In that early book, it was postulated that a number of the Elohim, although he spelt it Elkim here, but I think that's just a typo, it's Elohim, gods, had indulged in a breeding experiment. This went wrong and they were expelled too, along with the race of Adam. These were the fallen angels. Now, where was the first earthly Garden of Eden? William F. Warren, in his scholarly work Paradise Found, or the Cradle of the Human Race at the North Pole, quotes from a translation by A.M. Sayce, taken from a book called Records of the Past. We are told of a dwelling which the gods created for their first human beings, a dwelling in which they became great and increased in numbers, and the location of which is described in words exactly corresponding to those of Iranian, Indian, Chinese, Eddaic and Aztecan literature, namely in the centre of the earth. Warren places the entrance to this paradise firmly and squarely in the North Polar area. There are many biblical references to this area. Here's a very pertinent one from Job. He stretcheth out the north over the empty place, and hangeth the earth upon nothing. He bindeth up the waters in his thick clouds, and the cloud is not rent under them. He holdeth back the face of his throne, and spreadeth his cloud upon it. He hath encompassed the waters with bounds until the day and night come to an end. Job 26, 7-10. An American who has done considerable research into the Hollow Earth theory is Raymond A. Palmer, a magazine editor and publisher. In an article, Palmer commented upon these verses from Job. Viewed from space, the Earth would seem to be spherical, and the hole would not in any way change the regularity of the sphere. Hole as in H-O-L-E, not W-H. So let me just read that again so you know it's hole, not hole. Viewed from space, the Earth would seem to be spherical, and the hole would not in any way change the regularity of the sphere. We will be discussing the hole later, author. We can easily understand this when Job makes his reiterated mentions of the clouds that cover the whole. Polar explorers curse this eternal fog, particularly in "He holdeth back the face of his throne, and spreadeth his cloud upon it." The Scandinavians have a legend of wonderful land far to the north called Ultima Thule, often confused today with Greenland. Is Ultima Thule, in that mysterious area beyond the pole, alleged to lead into the interior of the Earth? The well-known French writer Robert Charroux has written of the legends of the underground worlds of Agatha and Shambhala. There are many more references both in the Bible and in classical literature to this legendary inner world. Now we will present real solid proof that the Earth, without any doubt whatsoever, is hollow. Chapter 10. The conditions are favourable. William Reed pointed out at the start of his book, The Phantom of the Poles, that the Earth is round and flattened at the poles. At the time he wrote his work, it was probably not realised that the Earth is spherical rather than round. He wrote, "If now we can produce enough other evidence to prove that the Earth is double, then we have shown why it is flattened at the poles. The fact that the Earth is flattened at the poles is not any proof that the Earth is double or hollow." Italics here by the author. "It only shows that the shape of the Earth is not favourable to such a condition, but absolutely necessary, and gives a good foundation with which to start." The basis of Marshall B. Gardner's theme was that all nebulae evolve towards a certain form, that all planets, including our own, are hollow with entrances at the poles and with a central sun. Gardner suggested that the phenomenon known as the aurora borealis is really a reflection coming through the north polar entrance of the central sun in the interior. He pointed to the observations of the polar caps of Mars, Venus and other planets, and to the luminosity that was seen in those areas, which was from the central suns inside those planets. A snow cap would not reflect light with so much more vividness than the other surfaces of the planet, and only direct beams of light coming from a central sun could give that luminous effect above the surface of the planet, and varying as the atmosphere in the interior or above was clouded or clear. Had it been a mere ice cap, there would not have been this luminosity, and in particular, there would have been no luminosity when the planet was covered with clouds, as Lockyer says it was. Furthermore, the luminosity is precisely that what our own aurora borealis would look like if our planet was viewed from a great distance, and the light is the same in both cases. It is interesting that the Van Allen belts, zones of intense radiation surrounding the Earth, which were discovered a few years ago, this is in 1974, have gaps at both polar areas. Soon after their discovery, an article about the belts appeared in the Scientific American, complete with drawings of their shape. Palmer wrote in his magazine, commenting on this article, "Especially note the drawings of its shape, which are precisely a vast donut, with the spherical Earth pictured at its centre. In the whole of the donut, Especially note the drawings of its shape, which are precisely a vast donut, with the spherical Earth pictured at its centre in the whole of the donut. What if the Earth is not spherical, but actually donut-shaped, exactly as its surrounding Van Allen belt? Whatever makes the belt thusly shaped, might it not also be responsible for shaping the Earth similarly?" Amy Michel, in his straight line theory, proved that most of the flight patterns of the flying saucers are on a north-south course, which is precisely what would be true if the origin of the saucers is polar. Amy Michel is a very well-known French writer on UFOs and highly respected in the field of UFO research. Not sure if I'm pronouncing his first name correct there. It's A-I-M-E with apostrophe across the top of the E. Amy. Oh my, let's just call him Amy. Now, what is the accepted scientific thinking on the structure of the Earth today? This obviously is most important. It had been generally accepted for a very long time that the Earth had a fluid molten core. Geologists no longer hold to this view. They do not accept that the Earth is hollow either. Nevertheless, over the years they have changed their views, as scientists are prone to do. The Institute of Geological Sciences in London kindly sent the author a summary of the current thought on the Earth's interior. The Institute stated, pause for effect, "The Earth's interior has a layered structure. The outermost layer is the crust, beneath is the mantle, and then the core. Scientists cannot study the interior of the Earth directly. What we know of it is worked out from studying the way earthquake waves are bent as they pass through the Earth. The Earth's core is a dense material, probably iron with some dissolved sulfur and silicon. The outer core behaves as a liquid, but the inner core is a solid. The Earth's magnetic field is generated by circulation movements in the liquid outer core. Well, at any rate, the aforementioned material indicates that we've got rid of the old liquid molten core concept. The fact that I now think the inner core is a solid is another tremendous step forward for our case. The centre of the Earth would have to be made of solid material for it eventually to be proved hollow. Now, let's take a look at the way nature operates. Everything, including bones, hair and stalks of plants, is hollow. A geode stone is hollow, so why not planets? After all, a planet is a living body. A scientist, Dr. Orville Livingstone Leach, stated, "The possibilities of a land inside the Earth were first brought to my attention when I picked up a geode on the shores of the Great Lakes. The geode is a spherical and apparently solid stone, but when broken is found to be hollow and coated with crystals. The Earth is only a larger form of a geode, and the law that created the geode in its hollow form undoubtedly fashioned the Earth in the same way." Gardner postulated that all nebulae in space are hollow. Furthermore, he stated that comets, which in his view were dead planets, were also hollow, and in his book included a fascinating photographic reproduction of a drawing showing the head of Donati's comet as seen from Cambridge University on 1st of October 1853. The caption that appeared under the picture is well worth including here. The central nucleus is very plainly seen, surrounded by a sphere of glowing gases and enclosed by an outer envelope. The comet is passing through an area of conflicting forces, and this, and perhaps the excessive heat of the body, has caused the great split which extends through the envelope to the central sun itself. A comet is simply a planet which is disintegrating, and the photograph shows us the disintegration taking place, and just far enough advanced so that we can see the inner structure of the planet. And that structure is precisely what our theory says is the actual structure of all planets, our Earth included. We have here a tremendous concept, that everything, including nebulae, comets and planets, is hollow, along with everything in nature. This is certainly food for thought. The conditions for a hollow Earth are indeed favourable. So at the end of that chapter, I will just throw in my own 2 cents worth here and say that I disagree entirely with just about everything that the author has said, but he did make mention that scientists are often prone to changing their minds, changing their views, and changing their concepts. So I'm very much in agreement with the author there, and saying that this book, written in 1974, based on the spherical Earth model, is making the most sense of what information they had at hand at the time. Now that we know better, know that the Earth is stationary and planar, then we can just take all this information on board and add it to our current school of thought and see where we go from there. Chapter 11 says, has the North Pole been reached? Time for a port. Ah, lovely and sweet. An essential part of our case is that there is no North Pole. No single point, but instead a big area which is a warm sea dipping gradually into the interior of the Earth. This may sound incredible, but we will be presenting strong evidence to support this idea in the next few pages. At this stage, many of you will be thinking about those polar explorers who claim to have reached the North Pole. The first point to make is that compasses go completely haywire in the Arctic Circle. A very competent, honest and famous Norwegian explorer, Dr. Fridtjof Nansen, on his expedition to try and reach the North Pole in 1895, lost his bearings and freely admitted that he had not the slightest idea where he was for a very long period. In February 1895, after landing from the vessel Fram, Nansen set off on a northward sledge journey which he hoped would take him to the pole, and from there to Spitsbergen by way of France Joseph Land. From 29th of March 1895 until the spring of 1896, the Norwegian explorer was completely lost. Furthermore, to his astonishment, he discovered that after journeying through cold regions, the weather began to get warmer. He noticed that whenever the wind blew from the north, the temperature began to rise. At one time, the sun became unbearably hot. Imagine that, in the polar regions. Nansen took soundings and found that the depth of the polar water was very much greater than had been previously thought. He was surprised to find out how warm the water was at great depth. He did not know from where this warm water emanated. Then he came across animals that, according to accepted knowledge, should not have been in those regions. On 26th April 1895, Nansen wrote, I was not a little surprised yesterday morning when I suddenly saw the track of an animal in the snow. It was that of a fox. It came about west-southwest, true, and went in an east. The trail was quite fresh. What in the world was the fox doing up here? I looked around for it, but the weather was thick all day yesterday, and we might have been near it without seeing it. In any case, a warm-blooded mammal in the 85th parallel. We had not gone far before we came across another fox track. It went in about the same direction as the other, and followed the trend of the lane which had stopped us, and by which we had been up here, but presumably they were able to snap up some crustaceans in the open waterways. But why do they leave the coasts? That is what puzzles me most. Can they have gone astray? There seems little probability of that. To sum up the experiences of Nansen so far. 1. He was lost for a period from early 1895 to late spring 1896, a fact he freely admitted throughout that time. 2. The further north he went, the warmer it became, and at one point the weather was really scorching. On 16 April 1895, the sun scorched quite unpleasantly. The tent was pitched in broiling sun, and for days after the atmosphere was equable and stagnant. 3. He saw the trails of foxes, warm-blooded animals that should not have been in those areas. Now, what are we to make of all this? It is not proof, but is some kind of evidence that the warm weather, the warm water, and the animals might concede National Geophysical Year 1957 to 58. A tremendous amount of exploratory and research work was carried out by scientists of many nations in both polar areas, and that these activities have been continued ever since. I therefore decided to write to the Scott Polar Research Institute at Cambridge, who are the people on polar research. In my letter I brought to their notice the astonished remarks of Nansen upon finding the fox trails on the ice pack so far north, and also asked them to comment on the warm winds coming up from the north, the broiling sun which he is compelled to put up with for some days, and finally the warm sea that they eventually reached. My letter addressed to the director of the Institute was passed on to their librarian, who kindly replied on 5 November 1973 as follows. Dear Mr. Le Poer Trench, thank you for your letter of 26 October. There is a considerable mammalian wildlife population in the Arctic, including Arctic fox, Arctic rabbit, lemmings, polar bear, etc. Only the latter spends much of its life hunting on the frozen pack, though as Nansen indicates, other creatures occasionally stray from land proper onto the sea ice. The subject is dealt with admirably by Bernard Stonehouse in his book Animals of the Arctic, The Ecology of the Far North, London, Ward Lock, 1971. This book also contains useful chapters dealing with climate, etc. If after consulting this book you find yourself with additional queries, I would suggest paying a visit to our extremely well-stocked library of books and periodicals. Yours sincerely, H.G.R. King, Librarian. Although the Institute informed me about animal life in the Arctic, they did not comment on Nansen's very surprised remarks on finding the fox trails. After all, he was no novice at polar explorations. My other questions were not directly answered at all. Instead, I was referred to a book. I obtained this recommended work. It is a splendid affair of superb colour pictures of the Arctic animals, but on consulting the chapters on climate and the Arctic Ocean, I drew a complete blank in regard to Nansen's experiences. Naturally, I'm appreciative of the information supplied by the Scott Polar Research Institute, but it is surprising that it did not comment directly on Nansen's account of the warm winds coming from the north, the broiling sun for days on end, and the warm sea. I would have thought that these most unusual experiences undergone by the great Norwegian explorer would have been of very special interest to them. We now come to an extremely important part of our case. I refer to the behaviour of the compass needle in the polar regions. If we assume for the moment that the polar entrance is there, when you're entering the curve of the Earth, that is down into the interior, the magnetic pole pulls one end of the needle up toward the perpendicular position. When you're travelling down instead of horizontally on the Earth's surface and are entering the interior, the needle must point up towards the north magnetic pole, rather than north as it did when travelling on the Earth's horizontal surface. I hope that you are with me, as this is rather important. This is what happened to Nansen. Probably a good time just to make a quick comment there. Isn't that interesting? Earth's horizontal surface. The compass always works on the flat, but he's talking about it now going haywire, thinking that we're going into a north polar entrance into the interior of the Earth. So Nansen wrote, referring to Johansen, his assistant. One day, it was 24th November, he came in to supper a little after 6 o'clock, quite alarmed, and said, "There has just been a singular inclination of the needle to 24 degrees, and, remarkably enough, its northern extremity pointed to the east. I cannot remember ever having heard of such an inclination." If Nansen had still been on the surface of the Earth, his position at that time probably would have put the compass on an angle of 45 degrees, if not more. At this point, it is interesting to mention a race of people on the surface of the Earth that may play a role in our searches for the truth: the Eskimos. The Eskimos inhabit the Arctic coast of America from Greenland to Alaska and part of the Asiatic side of the Bering Strait. Some of them are found very far north near the polar regions, hunting the seal and other animals. It has already been mentioned that the further north you go, the colder it becomes. Then, as some polar explorers have discovered, the weather becomes milder, finally almost unbearably hot, and a warm sea is reached. This is a very important part of our case. The Eskimos are a people who have kept very much to themselves, for the most part friendly, but are hunters and prone to get fat through eating a lot of raw flesh. They are not a tall people, with mostly flat noses and oblique set eyes, but are intelligent and good-humoured. Now, I come to the real point about the Eskimos. In his book, Gardner stated that the Eskimo who came too far south found out what we've seen that the polar explorers from our own countries found out: a greater abundance of life further north. This may seem strange, but we have already mentioned how Nansen came across animals that, according to accepted thinking, should not have been there. Gardner wrote that the Eskimo came from the interior of the Earth, that is to say, from a location which they could not easily explain to the Norwegians, who might have asked them where they originally came from, is shown by the fact that the early Norwegians regarded them as a supernatural people, a species of fairy. He went on to quote from the second volume of Dr. Nansen's work, In Northern Mists. I've already stated that the Norse name Skraeling for Eskimo must have originally been used as a designation of fairies or mythical creatures. Furthermore, there is much that would imply that when the Icelanders first met with the Eskimo in Greenland, they looked upon them as fairies. They therefore called them trolls, an ancient common name for various sorts of supernatural beings. There you go, internet trolls. An ancient common name for various sorts of supernatural beings. I bet you'll love that. We will now discuss the respective claims of Dr. Frederick A. Cook and Admiral Robert Edwin Peary to have reached the North Pole. Cook claimed to have been the first man to reach the North Pole on 21st April 1908. His claim to have forestalled Peary was at first credited, and he was given a rapturous reception at Copenhagen, but scientific opinion in England and America was more reserved, and eventually, after a prolonged dispute, a special committee of the University of Copenhagen, to whom his documents were submitted, declared that they contained no proof that he had reached the pole. By that time, most other people had come to an adverse opinion, and the sensation was over. Cook had with him two Eskimos who knew nothing about determining latitudes or longitudes, and the notes he produced were not sufficient evidence to support his claim to have reached the pole. Now we come to the claims of Admiral Peary to have reached the North Pole on 6th of April 1909. An interesting point is that Peary sent back all his white companions a few days' march from the pole and pushed forward alone with his Negro servant and two Eskimos. As in the case of Cook, the whole business relies entirely on the word of Peary alone. Those that were with him had no knowledge of taking bearings as to their positions. Peary took even fewer observations of his claimed position at the pole than Cook had done. Furthermore, whereas Cook was challenged on his claim to have travelled 15 miles a day, Peary stated that he did some 20 to 40 miles a day. Actually 40 miles in one day, and remember that he and those with him were pushing their sledge through Arctic ice. Although Peary's word was at first accepted and the world acknowledged the pole had been reached, when his proofs were submitted for investigation, the committee stated that he had not proved his point. I must say here and now, though it seems likely from the investigations of the various committees concerned that probably both Cook and Peary did not reach the North Pole, which according to our case does not exist, tribute should be paid to both these fine explorers. No doubt both explorers really thought they had reached the pole. Dr. George Titman, who at the time of Cook and Peary's expeditions was head of the Coast and Geodetic Survey at Washington, made an interesting statement about what could be the actual physical conditions at the pole. He said, "There are really no scientific theories as to what is immediately around the pole. There are some theorists who think that there is an open sea and some who think that a fertile spot is there. Scientific men are inclined to think that there may be little difference in immediate conditions close to the pole from those in the Arctic regions miles from there." This is an amazing statement coming from a scientist, even though it is from one who has now left us. Now, you will recall the statements quoted earlier from the honest and competent explorer, Nansen, regarding the warm sea, the warm weather and trails of warm-blooded animals the further north he went. It is our thesis that there is an open sea in the area where the pole is supposed to be, because all explorers who have gone far enough north have found one. A most significant fact is that polar explorers who have journeyed some distance on the warm sea, including Nansen, found, in italics, that there was a very gradual foreshortening of the horizon from north to southwest. Distance remained constant. Surely this indicated that the warm sea descends into the interior of the Earth, that land beyond the pole that Admiral Byrd spoke about and which we'll be discussing later. Chapter 12. The Russians are onto it. It would seem that some years ago the Russians were trying to let a little of the proverbial cat out of the bag about the mysteries of the North Polar area. An article in the Scientific American pointed out that the Russians have discarded the idea of a single point at the North Magnetic Pole and now say that it is not a point at all, but a line approximately 1,000 miles long. They have also discovered much else, as you'll see in this chapter. Palmer, describing and commenting on the material in the Scientific American article in his own magazine, wrote, "But now we have, available in the form of the records of several hundred years in Russian archives, a history of Arctic exploration which proves our most important point beyond any further question. That is, that the pole is not a point, but, deduce the Russians, a line approximately 1,000 miles long. Before we go further, we might suggest that we think they are wrong in this deduction, and that instead of being a line, it is actually a circle. But because of the lack of space to place it on the globe, the Russians have been forced to compress their observations into the flattened out state that a circle becomes when compressed into a two-dimensional area. They had to squeeze the circle from two sides and make a line of it. We'd like to give you now a resume of that single phase of Russian exploration, which actually covered much more than just geomagnetism. Here is what the Russians say. Navigators in the high latitudes have always been troubled by the odd behaviour of their magnetic compasses, caused by apparent irregularities and asymmetries in the magnetic field of the Earth. Early magnetic maps have been drawn on the assumption, based upon hopeful guesses, that the North Magnetic Pole is virtually a point. Accordingly, it was expected that the compass needle, which dips more steeply as it approaches the magnetic pole, would point straight down, or very nearly so, at the magnetic pole itself. But data from many Russian and other expeditions showed that the compass needle points straight down for a very long distance across the Arctic Ocean, from a point northwest of the Taimyr Peninsula to another point in the Arctic archipelago. This discovery first inspired the hypothesis that there is a second North Magnetic Pole tentatively located at 86 degrees east longitude. More refined observation has disposed of this idea. The map of the magnetic field now shows the magnetic meridians running close together in a thick bunch of lines from the North Magnetic Pole in the Arctic archipelago to Siberia. Geomagnetic studies in coordination with the International Geophysical Year have been extended to high altitudes. This work has clarified the interaction of the magnetic field with the charged particles emitted by the Sun, especially with respect to the formation of the belts of radiation that surround the Earth, the generation of magnetic storms, and the production of auroral displays. Today, stations in the Arctic conduct regular simultaneous observations with stations in the Antarctic. Along with its great theoretical interest, the program has given improved accuracy to navigation charts of the Arctic regions. Exploration and research have shown that an enormous region of the Earth's surface and correspondingly large realms of the unknown may be brought within the compass of human understanding in a very few years. The data thus far amassed by expeditions and ice stations fill more than 120 volumes. The list of books, monographs and articles that is emerging from that data already exceeds 600 titles. That concluded Palmer's resume of the Russian scientific work on the Arctic from the Scientific American article. He went on, "Let's make some comments on the presented material, paragraph by paragraph. It is unnecessary to say much more about the geomagnetic readings, which have established that the pole, magnetically speaking, is a very extended area that crosses the polar basin from one continent to the other. It is at least 1,000 miles long, and more likely can be said to exist as a rather diffuse line for 1,000 more. Thus, when Admiral Peary and other Arctic explorers who used the magnetic compass claim to have reached the pole, he's making a very vague claim indeed. He can only say that he reached a point which could be anywhere in a demonstrable 2,000-mile area. The compass pointed straight down. a noteworthy achievement, but not a discovery of the pole. Next, having found themselves stumped to account for the strange observations in the polar basin, the theorists have turned to space and the upper atmosphere and even to the sun for an explanation of what is happening to their instruments. Now the pole is interaction of the magnetic field with charged particles from the sun. This brings us to the subject of mystery land of great extent in the polar areas which cannot possibly be placed on our globe without overlapping seriously in impossible ways. In the last two paragraphs of our quotation from the Russian data, we find much hidden inference, and we will try to point it out to you. First, let's examine the quotation. Exploration and research have shown that an enormous region of the Earth's surface and correspondingly large realms of the unknown may be brought within the compass of human understanding in a very few years. This is truly a stupendous sentence. Contemplate what it actually says. It says that not only exploration, but research have shown that enormous regions of the Earth's surface and corresponding, get that word, corresponding, large realms of the unknown may be brought into the compass of understanding of human beings in a very few years. In plain words, in addition to the areas we can understand and investigate by exploration, there are large realms which have to be brought to human understanding by means of research. Oh yes, large unknown and even beyond present understandability areas do exist, and it may be that we will discover and comprehend them in a very few years. We might say that all this is double talk. We might also say that secrets are being kept, but we won't. The fact is that neither is true. This is straight talk, the only kind of talk we can expect from anyone who is trying to tell something, but cannot because it is, as yet, beyond his understanding. To say definitely that there are large land masses inside an area commonly called a point is to be faced with the challenge to explain and to demonstrate and prove. Since this cannot yet be done, the speaker is left rather helpless to do more than vaguely hint at mysteries. What is it that exists at both poles of the earth which opens us to new frontiers so vast in extent and nature as to be beyond present understanding? It may well be that the exploration of space is far less important than the exploration of our own mysterious planet, now suddenly become a vast realm, far larger than we have ever dreamt it to be. With that, I'm going to take a 2-second break because although I did put on a shirt to do this reading, I'm really hot, so this is summer in Australia, and I really don't care. Let it breathe a bit. Oh, that's better. I better just check. I hope this is loud enough. I don't know if I can adjust that while we started. It is what it is. And I'm not using their laptop today because I've actually got it over there playing some plinky plonk music, and I found it was cutting out quite a bit. Hey, g'day, Psych Sid. Greetings from Flat, Texas. Greetings from northern New South Wales, Australia. Good to see you, mate. Chapter 13 is called Commercial Flights Over the Pole and Submarine Expeditions Under It. Now this, as I say, this book was written in 1974, so commercial flights have changed a bit since then, but I believe they had the Concorde back then, so it should be interesting, this. I bet this is the Concorde actually talking about. A certain airline which claims flights daily within 250 miles of the magnetic pole. It is because gyroscopic compasses don't work within 150 miles approximately of the pole, and that is why advertised flights over the pole do not go anywhere near it. No airline could afford to have its aircraft getting lost over the polar area, with all the consequent danger this would mean to the passengers. This too is why military pilots are instructed to make direction changes when the instruments begin to go haywire, so that they can get back into an area where the gyroscope works. Now let us turn our searchlight onto the expedition made to the pole underwater by the submarines Nautilus and Skate. It claimed that Nautilus went to the pole, crossed it, and then turned directly towards Spitsbergen. It did not go straight across the pole and continue on straight. The pole is never crossed by military and commercial aircraft unless it is a bird type of flight. Admiral bird, they mean, because it's spelled B-Y-R-D. unless it is a bird type flight, which we will be discussing later. They always play it safe and navigate so they won't get lost. And it is so very easy to get lost in the Arctic close to the pole. Why didn't Nautilus continue straight on after reaching the pole? Why did the submarine veer off to Spitsbergen? The reason is that prior to the polar trip, Nautilus had made an exploratory cruise under the ice pack in the autumn of 1957 and discovered there were problems. Her gyro compasses had failed, and again, by the next afternoon we, Skate, were within 150 miles of the pole, and our regular gyro compasses would no longer tell us which direction was north. Palmer, commenting on this situation, wrote, "So what did Nautilus and Skate use in navigating under the polar ice? Well, they invented a new use for a device originally designed as a guided missile gimcrack, the inertial guidance system. They adapted it to submarine navigation. In short, this system senses the Earth's rotation and charts its speed. Delicate instruments feel the direction of the motion resulting from the Earth's eastward spin, thus telling which direction is east. They sense speed as well as motion, and since the rotation of a point on the Earth's surface decreases as one goes towards the poles, the inertial gadgets can sense their distances from the pole. Think Nautilus and Skate reached a point where the inertial guidance system showed reached is the geographic North Pole. All it means is that they reached a failure point where the inertial guidance system no longer is able to determine motion, just as the gyro compass at a distance of 150 miles from the pole is unable to decide when it is being swerved and not being swerved from its axis of rotation. It seems that foolproof instruments to tell you that the pole has been reached simply do not exist. We have shown that magnetic compasses, gyro compasses, and even inertial guidance systems are not foolproof. Strange though it may seem, the likelihood is that no one has succeeded in reaching the North Pole. If our case is correct, then the North Pole is not just a point, but located in the big polar entrance. It is probable that Nansen and some other polar explorers have gone some distance into the interior. It is possible, as we shall see later, that Admiral Richard E. Byrd flew 1,700 miles beyond the pole to that enchanted continent in the sky. And with that, I will just pause for a second and show a couple of pictures. So you might want to, when you put this on replay, pause on this and have a closer look at it. I'll see if I can get it as clear as possible and see if you can get the writing in there. Call the South Pole on at the very same time. And since I'm doing it, here are some other pictures that they claim to be Earth. I don't know about that. They do claim it. This is what they claim to be a UFO. And prior to that, we had the, I don't know if I ever pronounced it correctly, the Perry-Reese map. So there you go, there's a few things if you feel like looking back later to have a look through for yourself. I don't know how to take those. More awkward questions. This poor old book is very beat up. As you can see, I've got it held together with duct tape. Actually, packing tape. 14 more awkward questions. There are a lot more questions that need good answers. Here is awkward question number. Where have you been all my life? There are a lot more questions that need good answers. I've already read that. Here is awkward question number 1. Why is there so much dust in the farthermost northern areas of the Arctic? Many polar explorers have found this dust most disagreeable. Nansen complained bitterly about it. Let us go home. What have we to stay for? Nothing but dust, dust, dust. The profusion of dust in the Arctic floats in great clouds and falls over ships, if they happen to be there, and colours the snow black. Where does all this dust come from? There are no active volcanoes in the Arctic. Reed wrote, the next query is concerning the great quantities of dust constantly found in the Arctic Ocean. What causes this dust? The volcanic eruptions that send up the rocks called shooting stars. What? The next query is concerning the great quantities of dust constantly found in the Arctic Ocean. What causes this dust? The volcanic eruptions that send up the rocks called shooting stars. One does not ask what this dust is composed of, for it has been analysed and found to be carbon and iron, supposed to have come out of some volcano. I repeat, where is this volcano? There are none in the Arctic Circle. However, if there was a burning volcano in the interior of the Earth, great clouds and dust would come up through it. I just really want to go back to that one line for a second. The volcanic eruptions that send up the rocks called shooting stars. Now, how often do we hear people on the flat Earth talking about what are shooting stars, what are meteors, where do they come from? There you have it from a person called Reed. I repeat, where is this volcano? There are none in the Arctic Circle. However, if there was a burning volcano in the interior of the Earth, great clouds and dust would come up through the entrance, falling onto the snow and colouring it a nightmarish black. This leads to our next question. What causes coloured snow in the Arctic region? We've already discussed the black snow caused by clouds of dust. There is also a strange phenomenon of red, pink, green, blue and yellow snow. This coloured snow has also been analysed and found to contain vegetable matter, supposed to be the blossom or pollen of a plant. No such plant is known to grow on the surface of the Earth. Reed tells us. The interior of the Earth is the only spot that will furnish us with an answer to this question. As the colours fall at different seasons, it is fair to presume that the flower matures at those seasons. Crane, in his first volume, page 44, says, "We passed the crimson cliffs of Sir John Ross in the forenoon of August 5th. The patches of red snow from which they derive their name could be seen clearly at the distance of 10 miles from the coast. They had a fine, deep rose hue, not at all like the brown stain which I noticed when I was here before. All the gorges and ravines in which the snow had lodged were deeply tinted with it. I had no difficulty now in justifying the somewhat poetical nomenclature which Sir John Franklin applied to this locality. For if the snowy surface were more diffused, as it is no doubt earlier in the season, crimson would be the prevailing colour. A flower that produces pollen in such profusion must need thousands of acres in which to grow. If, as already stated, no such flower grows on Earth, then the pollen must be wafted up through the polar entrance from the interior. This could not happen unless the Earth is hollow and the warm air coming up from the inside distributed the pollen over the Arctic region." Next question, please. If no rivers are flowing from the inside of the Earth to the outside, then why are all icebergs composed of fresh water? Reed wrote, "Icebergs are next in order. Where are they formed and how? In the interior of the Earth, where it is freezing and the water continuing to pass over it, freezing as it flows. This prevails for months until, owing to the warm weather in summer, the warmth from the Earth and the warm rains passing down to the sea, the bergs are thawed loose and washed into the ocean. Icebergs cannot be formed on Earth for the reason that it is colder inland than at the mouth of the stream. Hence, the mouth would be last to freeze and the first to thaw. Under those conditions, icebergs could not be formed. Finally, we ask this question: why is it warmer the further north you go? As you go farther north, it at first becomes very cold. Then as you get to the farthermost northern regions, it becomes warmer and, as Nansen found out, unbearably hot. If it can be proved by giving examples from explorers such as Nansen, we will quote another in a moment, that as you advance to the so-called pole, it becomes warmer. That game is more plentiful than further south. Then where can we say this warm climate, this heat, comes from? It can only come from a warm northerly wind blowing from the interior of the Earth." Reed quotes Captain C. F. Hall as follows: "We find this is a much warmer country than we expected. We have found that the country abounds with life, and seals, game, geese, ducks, musk, cattle, rabbits, wolves, foxes, bears, partridges, lemmings, etc. Why is it that birds and some animals migrate to the far north in the winter where it is much warmer and easier for them to find food?" A. W. Greeley, in his book 3 Years of Arctic Service, wrote of birds of a species not known to us: butterflies, mosquitoes and flies. Nansen was puzzled over the fox tracks that shouldn't have been there. The accepted thinking is that the further north you go, the colder it becomes, but many explorers have found quite the reverse, and eventually a warm sea is reached. This, theoretically, if the Earth is just a sphere and not flattened at the poles, is a sheer impossibility. However, we do know that the Earth is flattened somewhat at the poles, and we have the word of numerous Arctic explorers that the weather does become warmer, that a warm sea is reached. Moreover, that animal life and game is abundant. There can only be one answer. These animals and the warmth come from the interior of the world, where there is probably a subtropical temperature. Chapter 15, Secret Geodetic Surveys. And for that, I think we better have a wee nip of keeper's glove. Not too much because we do have work tomorrow. Can you believe it? You got offered a work shift tomorrow. Woo-hoo. Oh well. It happens. Oh, that was too good. Oh, that was even better. Secret geodetic surveys. This is the chapter that first blew my mind into thinking that we actually already live on the inside of a hollow sphere. I think. Yeah, this will be the one. Why was it made certain tests which upset the Copernican theory and then decided that they should be kept secret? We feel that the results of those tests have an important relationship to the case for a hollow Earth. The material in this chapter consists of extracts from an article written by Raymond A. Palmer, based upon one in the Scientific American, slightly edited by him, reproduced here with his kind permission. If you've ever watched a bricklayer at work, you've seen him use a plumb bob to determine the perpendicular so that his wall will be erect and straight. A plumb bob is simply a weight suspended on the end of a cord. It acts on the principle of the attraction of gravity, or mass, and the weight always points towards the centre of gravity, which in the case of the spherical Earth is its exact centre. A line formed by the chord of a plumb bob is at precisely a right angle from the horizontal. It is a division of a plane surface into two 90-degree angles. By simply laying his bricks parallel to the line of the plumb bob, the bricklayer builds a wall that is precisely correct. If he did not use a plumb bob, there would be many more leaning towers of Pisa in the world. Pisa, not pizza. However, the plumb bob is not used only to erect buildings, but to measure the distance of the Sun or any planet. Sometime prior to 1901, the French government wished to determine more accurately the actual size of the Earth so that they could revise and refine their calculations regarding the distance apart at the top of two lines perpendicular to the surface of the Earth and the bottom of those same two lines. They wanted a pair of lines long enough to give them an appreciable measurement. Obviously, they allow poles a mile high, but they did feel it was possible to suspend two plumb bobs a mile deep into a mine shaft and thus be able to measure the distance apart at the top and the distance apart at the bottom, which would be slightly less. Now, how much less? The results of these tests were very strange. So strange, the French geodetic survey and conveyed the results to them, with the request that similar tests be done and conducted in the United States. Officially, nothing was done for some years. Then, in 1901, one of the geodetic surveyors happened to be working in the vicinity of the Tamarack mines near Calamute, Michigan. He contacted the chief engineer at Tamarack and informed him of the information transmitted by the French government. The mine shafts were selected, and plumb lines exactly 4,000 were suspended in each mine. To prevent movement through a horizontal direction, each bob was suspended in a tank of the mine shafts. In this way, it was reasoned, magnetic forces would not affect them. The lines used to I'm reading this too fast because I'm excited. The lines used to suspend the bobs were numbered 24 piano wires. For 24 hours, the lines were allowed to hang so that there would be no possibility of movement from putting them in place still remaining in the lines. The measurements were begun. It was then that it was discovered that the French geodetic engineers had not made a mistake. Careful rechecking proved that the lines, contrary to expectations, were further apart at the bottom than at the top. I'd like to read that one more time for those of you who may have just be glossing over this, not really listening and paying attention. It was then that it was discovered that the French geodetic engineers had not made a mistake. Careful rechecking proved that the lines, contrary to expectations, were further apart at the bottom than at the top. There can only be one implication from such a strange result. The centre of gravity is not, as previously believed, at the centre of the Earth, but in fact must be above the surface of the Earth. Greatly puzzled and not a little disturbed, the Tamarack engineer sent for Professor McNair of the Michigan College Mines. With McNair there to check the results, the experiment was repeated and the measurements gone over again. Both men were convinced that no error had been made. Professor McNair suggested that the plumb bobs be changed in their substance to overcome any possibility of magnetic attraction or repulsion due to a magnetic ore body nearby. When this was done, the same figures were arrived at. If magnetic influences had been at work, they would have varied with different metals, but they did not. Now, suggested McNair, it would be a good idea to prevent air currents from travelling up and down the mine shafts which might be affecting the plumb lines. Thus, both mine shafts were sealed at the top. Once more, the figures remained the same. Professor McNair, when questioned, stated for publication that he had proved that magnetic attraction from the Earth or the sides of the shaft did not cause the strange divergence. Then he went back to the Michigan College of Mines and wiped the whole thing from his mind. A second series of experiments were conducted at Calumet. This time, 2 elevation shafts into the mine were used instead of 1, those numbered 2 and 5. These 2 were 4,250 feet apart and were also 4,250 feet deep. They were connected at the bottom by a perfectly straight transverse tunnel. Now, plumb bobs were hung in each shaft and measurements were made. This time, the tunnel were 8.22 inches further apart at the bottom than at the top. It did not take the Tamarack engineer long to discover that this figure exactly represents the divergence that would be necessary to complete a 360-degree spherical circumference. There was only one difficulty. As expressed by the plumb lines, it would be the circumference of the inside. The angles formed by the plumb lines would be approximately 4,000 miles out in space. Obviously, this could not be quite true, because if the Chinese were to make calculations based on a similar pair of mine shafts of the globe, the centre of gravity would be found to be 4,000 miles in the other direction. The centre of gravity, according to the plumb lines, was a sphere's surface some 16,000 miles in diameter. Any place 4,000 miles up was the centre of gravity. Can we blame the Tamarack engineer for going down in his mind and maintaining a grim silence from that moment on? The Earth is a sphere with certain very minor irregularities. On the outside of it, the Moon circles the Earth and the Earth circles the Sun. Some force holds them all in orbit and in their relationships to each other. It is said the Moon's orbit is maintained because the attraction of mass of both bodies is exactly counterbalanced by centrifugal force. The Earth system is maintained in its orbit about the Sun by the same delicate balance. Could it be that there is no such thing as attraction of mass? Or could it be that the Earth is really something that tells you that if it is hollow, we're on the inside of it? And that's a theory that I'd been working with personally myself for many years, since I was about 17 or 18 when I first got hold of this book and started thinking, well, hang on, it doesn't mean that if it's hollow and there's central sun, well, why isn't our sun then the central sun? Then what are the stars? Well, maybe some sort of holographic projection around the fact that above us, as it gets further and further away, as all things do, it will appear to get lower and lower, as things do with distance, and eventually it will be obscured by everything in front of you, which does appear to rise up. So, hollow Earth. Chapter 16, That Land Beyond the Pole. Oh, my finger is just, I can't bend it further than that. I crushed it good. Last time I did something like that, entire finger crushed in a car door. I just need more ice. This thing's hot now. Maybe the beer will be cold. Oh, hurts to hold. Towards the end of his remarkable book, Gardner made an appeal to the government of his great country, the United States of America, to mount an expedition using both ships and aircraft for the purpose of exploring the interior of the Earth. It would seem the US government has carried out Gardner's suggestion, and that initial explorations of a few thousand miles into the interior have been made, on more than one occasion, by the US Navy with aircraft under the command of that great explorer, the late Admiral Richard E. Byrd. The Admiral... I'm having trouble saying that word. The Admiral made it very plain in public pronouncements that the areas visited were out of this world. Those were not his words, but the descriptions he gave of the fantastic lands beyond the pole put them in that category. Possibly Byrd made several flights some way into the interior of the Earth. In recent years, a clampdown seems to be operating about these flights, and the whole business is now very much under wraps. This, of course, I expect to be denied. The US government cannot do anything else. All the Admiral's papers are kept from public record. According to the Encyclopaedia Britannica, this very distinguished American was born in 1888 and died in 1957. The encyclopedia states that on 9th of May 1926, Byrd and his co-pilot, Floyd Bennett, flew over the North Pole. Then on 29th of November 1929, with 3 companions, he flew over the South Pole. In 1947, he made a second flight over the South Pole. Finally, on 8th of January 1956, he flew over the South Pole for the 3rd time. This great explorer and splendid man was also highly involved in organising what became known as Little America in the South Polar area, an American base there. Before commencing a flight over the South Polar area in 1947, the Admiral publicly stated, "I'd like to see that the land beyond the pole, that area beyond the pole, is the centre of the great unknown." Palmer wrote, "Millions of people read his statement in their daily newspapers, and millions thrilled to the Admiral's subsequent flight to the pole and to a point 1,700 miles beyond it. Millions heard the radio broadcast description of that flight, which was also published in the newspapers." Now, here is Byrd mystery number 1. Palmer's article was referring to a flight in 1947 by the Admiral over the North Pole, which apparently he did not make. The Encyclopaedia Britannica does not list a North Pole flight for 1947. The reason for this was given in Palmer's next issue of his magazine. He knew about Byrd's flight over the South Polar area, but as a book had been published called Worlds Beyond the Poles by F. Amadeo Giannani, reports from both radio and newspaper sources, Palmer decided to go on a fishing expedition, so to speak, to see if he could draw out something. It was just mystery number 2. Palmer lives in Amherst, Wisconsin, USA. He wrote that at about 3 miles from him was Nelsonville, and that this was the home of Lloyd K. Grenly, though that gentleman lived more recently in Green Bay, where he served in the Federal Aviation Agency before his death on 7th of June 1970. However, Grenly's family are Palmer's neighbours. In Palmer's words, this is important only because Lloyd K. Grenly was the radio man on Admiral Byrd's expedition to the South Pole in 1926 and to both poles in 1929. It was emphatically denied that he made flights to both poles in 1929. That year, a newsreel could be seen in America's theatres which described both flights and also showed newsreel photographs of the land beyond the pole, north, with its mountains, trees, river, and a large animal identified as a mammoth. Today, this newsreel does not exist, although hundreds of my readers remember, as I do, this movie short. Thus, I have it on my own personal viewing of this movie short, and from the radio man who went with Byrd to that land beyond the pole and saw the things recorded on that film, that this unknown, uncharted, and presently denied land exists. Palmer stated that hundreds of his magazine readers recalled seeing the newsreel. Here is a letter from one of his readers emphasising his point. "Dear Ray Palmer, there still seems to be a considerable controversy about Admiral Byrd's flights to the North and South Poles and what he saw in the interior of the Earth at the South Pole. But nobody ever mentions the document about the United States soon after Byrd's return home. My sister and I saw this in White Plains, New York. Byrd narrated this film himself and exclaimed in wonder as he approached a warm water lake surrounded by conifers with a large animal moving among the trees and what Byrd described as a mountain of coal sparkling with diamonds. Sincerely, Dorothy E. Graham, Miss." Byrd and his companions should have seen nothing but ice and water. However, they were flying over a very mysterious terrain. The Admiral's polar flight seemed to be shrouded in more than one mystery. The Encyclopaedia Britannica only records one polar flight by Byrd in 1929, yet the radio man stated that there were 2, one over the North Pole and one over the South. Why did Giannani in his book state that the Admiral flew over the North Pole in 1947, giving newspaper and radio sources for his information, when Byrd is on record as having only flown over the South Pole that year? Is it possible that Byrd flew over both poles in 1929 and over both poles in 1947? In April 1955, the US Navy announced that an expedition to the South Pole was to be led by Admiral Richard E. Byrd. It consisted of 5 ships, 14 aeroplanes, special tractors, and a complement of 1,393 men. The ostensible purpose was to construct a satellite base at the South Pole. This, of course, turned out to be not the real reason at all. The following announcement is bird mystery number 3. In San Francisco, on the eve of his departure, Admiral Byrd delivered a radio address in which he stated, "This is the most important expedition in the history of the world." Well, no doubt it was an important expedition, but why did he claim it to be the most important in the history of the world? On 13th of January 1956, Byrd and the US Navy flew to a point 2,300 miles beyond the South Pole. The entire distance was stated to have been accomplished over land. Now, if you look at your map, the South Polar continent is entirely surrounded by water. No matter in what direction you proceed from the South Pole, hundreds of miles over water have to be traversed to reach a total distance of 2,300 miles. It was announced by press and radio on 5th of February 1956 that on 13th of January, members of the United States expedition accomplished a flight of 2,700 miles from the base at McMurdo Sound and penetrated a land extent of 2,300 miles beyond the pole. A point worth noting is that the International Geophysical Year research program was planned in 1947, the year of Byrd's flight of 1,700 miles beyond the South Pole. The International Geophysical Year started in 1957, just after his flight of 2,300 miles beyond the pole the previous year. Byrd and his expedition had then set up Little America, the American base in the Antarctic. The IGY research program involved large-scale activity in both the Arctic and Antarctic areas. Was all this just a coincidence? An interesting point to reflect upon is that in 1929, the UFOs were not in evidence. A colour film was shown of Byrd's polar flight that year. It was in 1947, the year of Byrd's flight of 1,700 miles beyond the South Pole, that Kenneth Arnold's sighting of 9 gleaming objects flying near Mount Rainier, state of Washington, ignited the flying saucer saga in modern times. Soon after that, the authorities clamped down on publicising the Admiral's flights to the same extent. Apropos is the possibility of a clampdown. Palmer published a very interesting letter in his magazine. Here's an extract from it. Dear Mr. Palmer, I've been told that several years ago your magazine devoted several issues to the hollow earth theory and polar openings, and that you tried to stir up interest so people would search newspaper records concerning Byrd's expedition to the poles. It may interest you to know that I've uncovered so far a photo taken in 1947 by Admiral Byrd of an oasis. The caption reads, "First picture of mysterious Antarctic oasis." Pictured above is one of the most imagination-stimulating discoveries made by Admiral Richard E. Byrd's recent Antarctic expedition, a large ice-free area dotted with multicoloured lakes in a region hitherto considered to be perpetually blanketed by ice and snow. If I can but recover the rest of that issue, Mr. Reeve is referring to a back issue of the American Saga magazine. It explains that Byrd found animals of prehistoric nature at the pole, and also that he thought he had crossed over to another planet. We now know that to be false, but we did not see what Byrd saw. I'll just repeat that. We now know that to be false, but we did not see what Byrd saw. The news I speak of was suppressed or cut short immediately in 1947. That year was Byrd's second expedition to the South Pole. If these things are not, so why else are all of Byrd's papers kept from public record? Since Byrd's expeditions were government financed and controlled, the answer is obvious. Bill G. Revis. Palmer, commenting on this letter in his magazine, stated that on the Byrd flight of 1947, large animals looking like mastodons were seen, and quite rightly pointed out that the mastodon is extinct on the surface of this planet. Shortly before the Admiral died in 1957, he described the newly discovered territory in these words, "That enchanted continent in the sky, land of everlasting mystery." That's Admiral Byrd said shortly before he died in 1957. Quote, "That enchanted continent in the sky, land of everlasting mystery." End quote. This is the most significant and revealing of all his dramatic statements. You see, upon entering the polar opening, there is an optical illusion of an island in the sky, this being a reflection of the Earth's surface on the sky, which has been observed by many polar explorers. Did the Admiral fly several times some way into the interior of the Earth? I'm sure he did just that. There you go. Might be a good time for you to go and have a wee. Chapter 17, the South Polar Entrance. Yeah, I think this one needs port. Might be able to bend my finger soon. Oh, God, it hurts. There have been some exceptionally well authenticated UFO sightings in Antarctica. The first UFO sighting on record in that area occurred in March 1950. Commander Augusto Vaz Orrego of the Chilean Navy saw a number of UFOs circling above them. The commander's report stated, "During the bright Antarctic night, we saw flying saucers, one above the other, turning at tremendous speeds. We have photographs to prove what we saw." What happened to those photographs? As far as is known, they have never been released to the newspapers. During January 1956, a group of Chilean scientists had been flown by helicopter to Robertson Island in the Weddell Sea to study the geology, fauna and other features of the locality. Gordon Creighton described the very impressive UFO sightings these scientists experienced in an article published in Flying Saucer Review called "A Cigar-Shaped UFO over Antarctica." He wrote, "At the beginning of January 1956, during a period of stormy weather, the party suddenly became aware of something which, in other circumstances, could have been very grave for them. This was that their radio had mysteriously ceased to function. This was, however, not too worrying a disaster in so much that it was firmly settled that the helicopter would return to take them off again on January 20. At the request of the two scientists, their true names are not divulged by UFO Chile. This group sent Flying Saucer Review the report in their bulletin number 2. Referred to herein as by the substitute names of Dr. Tagle and Professor Barros." Creighton explained that Dr. Tagle was in the habit of getting up in the night to observe anything of meteorological interest, but that the professor, on the other hand, did not like to be disturbed. However, on 8th of January, Dr. Tagle saw something so out of the ordinary that he went back to the hut and woke up the professor, who dressed and came out with him. Dr. Tagle pointed upwards, almost overhead, still in a bad temper through being disturbed. Barros looked as directed, and beheld two metallic, cigar-shaped objects in particular positions, perfectly still and silent, and flashing vividly the reflected rays of the sun. Soon after 7 a.m, they were joined by the other two members of the party, an assistant and a medical orderly. They all watched the two craft. At about 9 a.m, object number 1, the nearest to the zenith, suddenly assumed a horizontal posture and shot away like a flash towards the west. It had now lost its metallic brightness and had taken on the whole gamut of visible colours of the spectrum, from infrared to ultraviolet. Without slowing down, it performed an incredible acute angle change of direction, shot off another section of the sky, and then did another sharp turn as before. These vertiginous manoeuvres, the zigzagging, abrupt stopping, instantaneous accelerating, went on for some time right overhead, the object always following tangential trajectories in respect to the Earth, and all in the most absolute silence. The demonstration lasted about 5 minutes. Then the object returned and took up position beside its companion in almost the same area of the sky as before. But now it was the turn of number 2 to show its paces and do a weird zigzagging dance. Shooting off towards the east, it performed a series of 10 disjointed bursts of flight, broken by brusque changes of direction and marked by the same colour changes when accelerating or stopping, and so on. After about 3 minutes of this, object number 2 returned and took up its station near the companion and reassumed its original solid and metallic appearance. The scientists had with them 2 Geiger-Miller counters of high sensitivity, one of them auditory and the other of the flashing type. When the 2 objects had finished their dance and resumed their stations in the sky, someone discovered that the flash-type Geiger counter now showed that radioactivity around them had suddenly increased 40 times, enough to kill any organism subjected long enough to it. The discovery greatly increased the anxiety felt by the 4 men, as may well be imagined. Although they had no telescopic lens, they did however have cameras with them, and they took numerous photographs of the objects, both in colour and black and white. We are not told in the report what became of these photographs. While Professor Barros felt no fear that they were likely to be in danger of attack from the objects, he had to admit that it was borne in all 4 men that they were face to face with a phenomenon of non-human origin, and they were being spied upon by an intelligence that for some reason or other desired to remain anonymous, and whose next moves were utterly unforeseeable. The sighting of these two objects lasted altogether 2 days. This is a very long time for UFOs to be seen. In lighter vein, might this be suggested for an inclusion in the next edition of the Guinness Book of Records? To conclude, Creighton's Admiral report referring to the second day. At about 11 p.m, the Antarctic blizzard, a wind capable of reaching velocities of 300 kilometres per hour, began to get into its stride and the sky clouded over. At about 2 a.m, at the height of the storm, the scientists established that the radioactivity level had dropped, and at the same time the extraordinary psychological tensions reigning among the party had suddenly dropped too. Even before they were able to prove it visually, the party was certain that the objects had gone. Next day, the radioactive level was back at normal, and that evening a break in the storm brought a brief clearance of some 40% of the sky, and they were able to see for themselves that the things were no longer there. On January 20, the helicopter picked up the party. Though they did not dare report their experience officially for fear of ridicule, they did decide to tell one man, a high-ranking officer in the Chilean army, who heard their story calmly, without surprise. This officer knew of many sightings of UFOs, registered in almost all the expeditions to Antarctica, but he had never heard of one that lasted so long and was so precise in all its details as this. And the Air Technical Intelligence Center, ATIC, in the USA, in due course sent a lengthy questionnaire which Barros and Tagle completed and returned. This sighting has everything. It starts with the radio being put out of action. This is a commonplace occurrence with UFO sightings in the near vicinity. If there had been a car, that would have been temporarily out of order. These scientists saw these two objects clearly in the sky overhead, absolute for a very long time. Indeed, so much that Creighton, in his article, wrote, "They looked as if they had always been there from the beginning of time, part of the sky itself." Then, they each in turn gave magnificent displays of their capabilities as regards not only flight, but their fantastic speed, abrupt turns and sudden stops far beyond our present capabilities. This sighting of these two cigar-shaped objects over Antarctica ranks as one of the classic ones. It is a great pity that the eyewitnesses did not allow their names to be mentioned. Nevertheless, it is an outstanding one. Then, in July 1965, there followed an even more authenticated sighting, though it did not last so long. This was a really first-class multi-witness sighting. This time the witnesses included not only naval personnel from 3 countries, but scientists as well. The Brazilian newspaper, O Estado de Sao Paulo, gave the following report with an 8 July dateline. For the first time in history, an official communique has been published by a government about the flying saucers. It is a document from the Argentine Navy, based on the statements of a large number of the Argentine, Chilean and British sailors stationed in the naval base in Antarctica. The communique declared that the personnel of Deception Island Naval Base saw, at 19 hours 40 minutes on 3 July, a flying object of lenticular shape, with a solid appearance and a colouring in which red and green prevailed, and for a few moments yellow. The machine was flying in a zigzag fashion and in a generally western direction, but it changed course several times and changed speed, having an inclination of about 45 degrees above the horizon. The craft also remained stationary for about 20 minutes at a height of approximately 5,000 metres, producing no sound. The communique states, moreover, that the prevailing meteorological conditions when the phenomenon was observed can be considered excellent for the region in question and the time of year. The sky was clear and quite a lot of stars were visible. The Secretariat of the Argentine Navy also states in its communique that the occurrence was witnessed by scientists of the 3 naval bases and that the facts described by these people agree completely. It is understood that the photographs taken by a photographer at one of these bases will be made public after they have been analysed by scientists. Whatever happened to these photographs too? There are an awful lot of excellent UFO pictures taken by the military that have been kept under wraps. There could well have been a lot of other UFO sightings in Antarctica that have not come to light. We're extremely lucky to learn that these 2 excellent reports, especially as in both cases military personnel. However, it would seem that the authorities in South American countries are, or should we say were, more prone to release information about UFOs than their counterparts in Britain and the United States. At any rate, these 2 sightings indicate that the UFOs are around that region. This is to be expected, for the South Polar entrance is in Antarctica. It is not situated at the point on the map called the South Pole. Amundsen and Scott both reached that point, the South Pole, and in 1956 Admiral George Dufek of the United States Navy landed there from the air. Since that time, a base has been established at the South Pole and has been continuously occupied by scientists doing research work. The South Polar opening is in the region of the map of Antarctica called the Area of Inaccessibility. The entrance is some distance away from the South Pole, anything from 600 to 1800 miles. The Area of Inaccessibility is quite a vast one. Typo again, I think. It just says, you can imagine Antarctica. If you can imagine Antarctica as a clock face, then if you look at your map of the continent, the area of inaccessibility will be roughly 2 o'clock from the South Pole. It is similar in size to the hole beyond the so-called North Pole, that is, not more than 285 miles in diameter and not less than 50. It is interesting to consider why this place is called the Area of Inaccessibility. You might think that the terrain is pretty tough. That is probably true, but the real reason for its name is the result of navigation problems. There are no bases in the Area of Inaccessibility, though the Russians have one on the edge. This is very significant and relates to their discoveries of unknown areas at the North Pole. In this area, the magnetic compass is useless. Inertial guidance systems does not function either. It is possible to reach the geographical South Pole through inertial guidance, but not the hole in the Area of Inaccessibility. Palmer wrote, pause for effect. It should be obvious why the rotation of Earth can be measured accurately when you are not accurately located on the arc of the Earth's surface. In short, if you are not located perpendicular to any line drawn through the centre of the Earth, you cannot determine the rotational speed of the planet with accuracy. In an area where the rotational speed, for example, might be 380 miles per hour, you could get a reading of 0 if your angle to the perpendicular was deviated by approximately 30 in Earth's surface. It would seem that anyone entering that area will come back out only by incredible luck. Naturally, if we get into the area of a hollow Earth and an inhabited one, we can conceive of some very sophisticated defences on the part of the inhabitants which might both prevent anyone from coming in or from getting out. The polar entrances are now much more difficult to locate than before the Earth tilted on its axis thousands of years ago. In antediluvian times, what are now polar areas were very likely aligned with the equator. In any case, when the flood came, the polar entrances were hidden by snow and ice. Antarctica holds many mysteries and hidden secrets. In the last quarter of a century, some remarkable discoveries have been made on that continent. On 6th of October 1973, the Times published a report based on an article in an issue of Nature dated the previous day. The Times stated that some 17 lakes had been found under the Antarctic ice. The discovery of the lakes had been made by Dr. G.K.A. Oswald and Dr. G.D.Q. Robin of the Scott Polar Research Institute. The newspaper reported that these lakes varied in width from 1 kilometre to 15 kilometres. The lakes were located by means of special radio echo sounding technique. Radio pulses were sent down from the US Navy plane in which the two men were flying, and these passed through the ice and bounced off the rock below. Some places were found where the radio echo was much more pronounced, as if it was not being reflected off rock but from a smooth horizontal surface. The conclusion was reached that there were lakes under the ice. According to Nature, one of the lakes was discovered near Sovietskaya station during the period 1967-68, while the other 16 were found during the ice near Sovietskaya, and 2 of the others are close to saddles on the ice surface, while the remainder are bunched together around a dome of ice which covers them to a depth of between 2.8 kilometres and 4.2 kilometres. Back in February 1947, an extremely important discovery was made of an ice-free area in the southeastern part of Antarctica. This place is now known as Bunger's Oasis after Lieutenant Commander David Bunger, who found it. At the time, Bunger was piloting one of the transport seaplanes that Admiral Byrd used in Operation High Jump. Bunger and his crew were flying inland near the Queen Mary coast of Wilkes Land. While only a few miles from the sea, they suddenly saw below their plane something quite different from the monotonous snow-white terrain, which was their daily fare. What a shock to see ahead of them a brown tract of land entirely ice-free, an area covering some 300 square miles. Most surprising of all were the lakes. These too were free of ice, blue and green colour, and was more than 3 miles in length. These lakes, according to my National Geographic Society map of Antarctica, were really inner arms of the sea, scattered among 300 square miles of bare brown hills. Bunga was staggered by the fact that the colours in the lake were so bright. It seemed as though something under the water caused them to reflect such vivid light. He landed his seaplane on one of these lakes and then received another surprise. The water in the lake was warmer than that in the sea. Two sides of the oasis had huge sheer walls of ice, and the others were not so steep. There are traditions of a legendary rainbow city in Antarctica. This may have been in the area of Bunga's oasis. These lakes could be reflecting the colours of the city from which its name originated, and perhaps Commodore Cousteau, the famous underwater explorer, should undertake an expedition to explore below their surface and seek for the fabulous lost city. Rainbow City was supposed to have been built thousands of years before the flood, and all the colours of the rainbow were said to have been used in the construction of the buildings and even in the paving of the streets. When the Earth tilted on its axis thousands of years ago, the city may have been submerged under the waters. The remains of it may be located under Bunga's oasis, and the different colours of buildings reflecting up through the waters of the various lakes. You will recall that it seemed to Bunga as if something below the surface caused the water to give out more light than is normal. Is Rainbow City there? A fascinating conjecture. I will take 5. Okay. 25 seconds. Approximately. I'm so sore and stiff. Doing all this gardening, digging work has been good until I smashed my bloody finger. But I suppose it served me right. It is Sunday. It's supposed to be a day of rest, and I guess that's just nature's way of telling me, have a fucking rest, Roscoe. It's a day off. I was like, oh yeah, good thinking, mate. Thanks for the reminder. I don't need to tie a string around that. That's going to go black. If it hasn't already. I should go stick that back in the freezer. Oh well. Chapter 18. What satellite photographs show? Now, if you know me, stop staring at me nipple, would you? If you know me, I'm not a believer in satellites whatsoever. But I certainly believe that they can send various aircraft or helium blimps, helium balloons, different kinds of things, drones, remote controlled objects up very, 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 very high and take pictures where men themselves can't exist, you know. And so it's quite possible that we prove that with just by explaining how impossible it is for the moon to exist on a stationary, in the heliocentric model. It's simply impossible. If the Earth is orbiting the Sun at 66,000, let's say 67,000 miles per hour, then sometimes the moon is going to be in front of us and sometimes it's going to be behind us. And so if it's just in free fall, dropping around us, falling around us, how the hell does it stay repelled from us as we're going towards it? And how the hell does it attracted towards us as we're going away from it? And how does it speed up and get back in front of us again? It's just simply completely impossible. And the same thing applies to all satellites. But anyway, this chapter is titled What Satellite Photographs Show. Further evidence that there is something very mysterious about the operation of the laws of physics in the polar areas is shown by what occurred during the launching of the first polar orbit satellites. It is incredible that out of 17 US polar experimental shots, only 2 gave the expected result when a specific factor was introduced, a definite change in the procedure which deliberately avoided a course directly over the pole. All cones released over Alaska and the nearby polar area were picked up. It should be explained that when a rocket was fired into orbit over the pole, it was calculated precisely where the nose cone should be released by a radio-triggered device. Personnel would be ready at the prescribed place to pick up or catch the nose cone as a parachute lowered it slowly to the Earth's surface. Now, in making their calculations, the technicians were presumably working on the assumption that the Earth was completely spherical and that there was no polar entrance to the interior. What had not picked up the fact that those nose cones were released in that mysterious area beyond the pole where the entrance to the interior of the Earth is believed by some people to be situated. It is obvious that those early nose cones were lost because the laws of physics do not operate over the polar areas as they do over the rest of the Earth. All these losses must have cost the American taxpayers millions of dollars. On 10th of August 1960, the Discoverer satellite was fired. The next day, after 17 passes around the Earth, the cone was released somewhere over the Arctic and was retrieved from the sea north of Hawaii. On 19th of August, a second cone was caught in mid-air as planned, this one having been ejected from the satellite over Alaska. Since then, a very large number of satellites have been successfully launched and some few million photographs taken in the last 14 years for meteorological and other purposes to do with the study of man's environment. Now we come to what is probably the most important contribution to our case for the hollow Earth, the visual one. In this book are reproduced the most exciting and remarkable photographs ever taken. The first one that I want to bring to your attention was taken by the ESA-7 satellite on 23rd November 1968. This picture is of the North Pole, which I did show that one earlier, but just in case you missed it, keep it relevant. That's it again. Where were we? Both. The following photograph is also taken on the same day by ESA-7 satellite, and this shows the South Pole area. Since I already showed that, may as well do that again as well. What they claim to be the South Polar area. Both are official photographs provided by the Environmental Science Service Administration, U.S. Department of Commerce. No, it doesn't say geography, it says U.S. Department of Commerce. Both pictures show a remarkably clear photograph of the cloud cover on that day over both poles. Both depict about 40% of the Earth's total area. Hang on, I thought I saw edges. Up to 10th December 1969, ESA-7 had taken 29,953 pictures when it was placed on standby mode. During 481 days, the picture of the North Pole is the only one which shows a total lack of cloud cover over that area, which is otherwise perpetually and almost completely obscured by clouds. It is this feature which is the most remarkable one concerning this photograph, although the detail and pattern of the clouds present in the picture is also remarkable. The photograph of the South Pole is equally detailed in its cloud pattern, but unlike the North Pole picture, it shows the polar area completely covered by clouds, thus no surface detail is observable. The North Pole photograph, which does not show clouds in the polar area, reveals the surface of the planet. Although surrounding the polar area, the north of such regions as the North American continent, Greenland, and the Asian continent, the ice fields can be observed. We do not see any in a large circular area at the geographical pole. What do we see instead? We're looking at the North Polar entrance, the hole at the pole. One of the difficulties in the past has been locating a satellite photograph that undeniably and clearly shows the polar entrance. Now, as it happens, the North Pole hole is also revealed in a photograph taken by another satellite, ESA-3, nearly 2 years earlier, on 6th of January 1967. On the same day, ESA-3 took a photograph of the South Polar ice cap showing cloud cover. Out of more than 1.5 million photographs showing cloud cover taken of the North Pole area up till 6th of January 1967, none of them had shown such a hole before. The reason for this being the previously mentioned almost perpetual cloud cover at the pole. Here then are two of the most thrilling photographs ever taken. They are dynamite. Incidentally, our case is strengthened by the fact that two photographs of the hole are shown here, each taken by separate cameras in two different satellites. This will dispose of any criticism that the hole was caused by a fault in the lens of the camera. We now present two colour photographs of Earth taken by ATS-111 satellite camera. The first one, NASA 67HC723, taken from a height of 23,000 miles. No date was given of the colour transparency supplied by NASA. Please note the depressed could well be a picture of the entrance taken from another angle. I guess that must be the ones they're talking about. strange depression at the top of the picture. I don't know if you can see it or if it's just bad editing by the publishers. Anyway, who am I to argue with the author? I'm just expressing his will as he wrote it. Now, the next picture is reproduced from the NASA book, Exploring Space with a Camera. It is ATS 111's photograph of Earth taken on 18th of November 1967. The vantage point is the equator at approximately 47 degrees west. Once again, what appears to be a moon crater can be seen at the top of the photograph. If there are polar entrances to the interior of the Earth, this would probably be top secret classified information. Now, these satellite photographs are in the public domain. The likelihood of anyone spotting the very few pictures showing the hole would be very, very long odds indeed. Possibly, it was considered wiser to leave them available along with all the millions of others, so as not to be accused afterwards of withholding information that is in the public domain. Palmer wrote, "If flying saucers have been in the top secret file, then the place they might come from certainly would be. Passing over the subject of flying saucers, there are many more reasons why a hole at the pole would be classified information. Militarily, it would seem to be highly significant, particularly if the inside of the Earth is inhabited, perhaps by a race far superior to us scientifically and technologically. The photographs taken by the ESA 3 and ESA 7 clearly show the polar entrance. If this black area, shown in the centre of the polar area, is not the hole, then perhaps the scientists will tell us exactly what it is." So now we come to chapter 19, the complete case. And I don't think I've ever talked so much in one go for frickin' months. I'm normally the quiet, contemplative type. However, I'm reading a book, so I shall carry on. The complete case. The hollow earth theory is only held by a small minority of people, so anyone putting forward a case for it is in a similar position to an advocate whose client has not had a good press. Nevertheless, this brief has been taken on because sometimes it is the maligned, discarded stone that is found to be the missing capstone of the pyramid. Earlier, it had been emphasised how important it is to look into every facet of our subject. The wealth of material that came to light on the hollow earth theory was immense, the evidence that has been submitted in this book. Now it is time to present a final summary of the case. Various points have been made that indicate the conditions are favourable for a hollow earth. A. The earth is spherical but flattened at the poles. If this was not the case, then as Reed pointed out in his own work, there'd be little point in writing this book. B. Gardner postulated that all planets are hollow with a central sun, including the earth. Furthermore, that everything in nature is hollow. For example, a geode stone is hollow. C. The old theory that the Earth had a fluid, molten core has gone into the garbage can. Modern scientific thinking has changed regarding the structure of the Earth. D. The Van Allen belts, zones of intense radiation surrounding the Earth, have gaps at each end over the polar regions. This could be a sheer coincidence, but it is very significant. The foregoing points all indicate that the conditions are favourable for a hollow Earth. Scientists, the military, are invited to take answers, if they can, to the following questions. 1. Nansen, Greely and other polar explorers have found when they get to the furthest northern regions of the polar area, the weather got warmer. What is the alternative answer to stating that this was caused by warm air blowing up through the polar entrance? 2. Polar explorers in the far north have come across a warm sea. Why should this be? 3. Abundant game and animal life have been discovered in these farthest north regions. Nansen was puzzled by the fox trails. Warm-blooded animals in that area were beyond his comprehension. The only answer seems to be that they came out of the interior of the Earth. 4. Now here is probably one of the most important questions of all. Why did Nansen find that in the farthest north area, the north-south horizon became foreshortened, while the east-west one remained constant? Surely this meant that he had gone over the lip of the hole and was beginning to descend very gradually into the interior. 5. If you are travelling down into the interior of the Earth, instead of proceeding horizontally on the Earth's surface, The compass needle must point up towards the North Magnetic Pole, rather than north as it did while travelling on the surface. This is what happened in the case of Nansen. Surely another indication that he went a little way down into the interior. 6. Why is there so much dust in the Arctic? It has been known to float around in great clouds and fall on ships. Nansen complained bitterly about this dust. It causes the snow on which it falls to turn black. This dust has been analysed and found to be composed of carbon and iron, supposed to come out of some volcano. There are no volcanoes in the Arctic, so the only place the dust could conceivably come from is a volcano inside the Earth, blown up through the entrance. 7. What causes coloured snow in the Arctic? This coloured snow has also been analysed and found to contain vegetable matter, supposed to be the blossom or pollen of a plant that does not grow on the surface of the Earth. The only answer seems to be that the pollen is blown by the warm winds from the interior of the Earth. 8. If no rivers are flowing from the inside of the Earth to the outside, then why are all icebergs composed of frozen fresh water? Has anyone actually seen an iceberg coming out of the river? The question of icebergs has been covered earlier. The only solution appears to be that the bergs come from rivers inside the Earth into that warm sea, then they make their way south. 9. The two scientific committees that examined the respective claims of Peary and Cook to have reached the North Pole were extremely dubious as to whether either of them got there. It is part of our case that there is no such thing as a North Pole point. If the Earth was completely spherical with no polar entrance to the interior, that would put quite a different complexion on the whole business. 10. Those airliners advertised as flying over the North Pole do nothing of the kind. Magnetic compasses and gyro compasses are virtually useless over a very wide area of the Arctic. No commercial airline could afford to allow aircraft to get lost and endanger the lives of the passengers. 11. The Russian discoveries in the polar area have been discussed. They have found that the pole, magnetically speaking, is not just a point, but extends for at least 1,500 miles across the polar basin in the Arctic area. Furthermore, let us reflect upon the tremendous implications of the quotation from the Russian data. Exploration and research have shown that an enormous region of the Earth's surface and correspondingly large realms of the unknown may be brought within the compass of human understanding in a very few years. That sentence is packed with dynamite. It would seem the Russians have, indeed, let the cat out of the bag. Apropos to these Russian discoveries, I spoke recently to Ray Palmer over the transatlantic telephone, and he said that intelligence officers from SAC, Strategic Air Command, had been trying to stop him writing about the hole at the pole. In his magazine, subsequently, a letter came from Palmer confirming this had occurred. Since then, a further issue of flying saucers has arrived. In this editorial, Palmer wrote, pause for effect. So our research into the possibility of a hole at the pole is a ridiculous fantasy. Then why is the Air Force's SAC spending so much time, including 1.5 hour phone calls, to get us to drop the subject? SAC, they say, flies a grid in the pole area which covers the entire top of the world, and every day at least one SAC atom bomber flies directly over that spot we say has a hole. And they see no hole. But they will not provide even one plane's flight plan with its navigation computations so that we can demonstrate where it cannot possibly approach within 640 miles of the geographic pole. The Russians published their findings that the magnetic pole is not a point at all, but a line called newly discovered mountain range called the Lomonosov Ridge. Strangely enough, as it is as long as the magnetic pole and exists in exactly the same location. I probably should read that sentence one more time. The so-called newly discovered mountain range called the Lomonosov Ridge, strangely enough, is as long as the magnetic pole and exists in exactly the same location. The ridge was discovered through ocean soundings, mostly from space satellites, but also by submarine and ship and aircraft radar. Computations of the photos taken from space showing the hole, we've published 3 of them, also strangely enough give a circumference of the rim of the hole which measures 1,500 miles. or 3 coincidence. The water can be shallow on the ridge because of centrifugal force, and obviously any SAC grid flown by stellar navigational observations based on a curvature of the Earth as a sphere 8,000 miles in diameter will be in serious error when taken from an area where the circumference is significantly more pronounced. The grid becomes a diamond-shaped web that describes a circle, not a partial hemisphere. I consider this great evidence of the flat planar Earth, mind you, if taken into consideration with the understanding of the planar Earth. 12. Consider those secret geodetic surveys by the French and American governments resulting in a complete upset in established scientific thought, in that the centre of gravity is not inside the Earth, but any point 4,000 miles out in space. Surely this indicates that the shape of the Earth is not what it is thought to be. It may even be hollow. 13. The polar flights of the late Admiral Richard E. Byrd are full of mystery. Why did the Admiral state publicly before the start of his 1947 flight over the South Polar area, "I'd like to see that land beyond the pole"? That area beyond the pole is the centre of the great unknown. And italics for the word beyond were put in there by the author, which I hope you read in the inflection of my voice. Why did he say on another occasion in a radio broadcast before leaving the USA for Antarctica, "This is the most important expedition in the history of the world"? Perhaps the most significant comment the Admiral made just before his death in 1957, when he referred to the newly discovered land as that enchanted continent in the sky, land of everlasting mystery. Mention has been made earlier that some of the polar explorers who unknowingly have gone a little way into the interior have noticed the optical illusion of an island in the sky. This surely is an indication that the Admiral did fly some way into the interior of the Earth. 14. Finally, the satellite photographs in this book have provided visual evidence of the North Polar entrance. Most of the year there is continuous cloud cover and fog over the area where the North Polar entrance is located. 2 photographs of the North Polar region without cloud cover, taken by the cameras of 2 different satellites, are included in the circular spot which is the polar entrance to the interior of the Earth. It would be interesting to know what else this dark area could be. And so now I come to part 3. I've been going for 1 hour 44 minutes. There's still that much of the book to go, so it's not, there's like a third left. I really have other things to be doing, but since I got to work tomorrow, I might as well just have a few quiet drinks. I'll continue reading, and we'll see how far we get through it. I've still got nearly half a beer left too. So this is chapter 20, The Green Children of Wolf Pits. If various races live inside the Earth, it would be only reasonable that they surfaced occasionally, even at times by accident. One of the most remarkable cases on record happened in England and concerns the green children of Wolf Pits. This is of a special interest if we bear in mind the references in the first part of this book by both Peter Colissimo and Harold T. Wilkins to an underground source of energy giving out a green fluorescence. Wilkins relates this story in another of his books, Flying Saucers Uncensored. The 12th century monk, Gervase of Tilbury, tells of the green children who emerged from some caves or pits in Suffolk in such queer circumstances that one might conclude either that they had been teleported from some world in space or from some terrestrial subterranean world. This story is also given by 3 other monastic chroniclers. William of Newburgh, whilst in Jerez. That's what he titled it. There is a village in England some 4 to 5 miles from the noble monastery of the Blessed King and Martyr Edmund, Pittes, Wolf Pitties, all one word, NB. I don't just say note. the modern wool pit, 7 miles from Bury St Edmunds, Suffolk. There you go. They give their name to the adjacent village. They came at harvest tide when the reapers were gathering in the corn. On a sudden there crept out from those two pits a boy and a girl, green at every point of their body, and clad in garments of strange colour and unknown texture. They wandered distraught about the field until the harvesters took pity on them and brought them to the village, where many thronged to see them, marvelling at the strangeness of the occurrence. And for some days these children refused all food that was placed before them. But it happened that some beans were brought in from the fields, and the two children snatched at them greedily and sat in the pits, weeping bitterly, for they found the pods empty. Then one of the bystanders offered them only shelled beans, which they took gladly and ate forthwith. On this food they were nourished for some days, until they learnt to eat bread. At length, under the prevailing influence of our food, they slowly changed the colour of their skin and learned to speak English. Then, on the advice of wise folk, they received holy baptism. But the boy, who seemed the junior in age, lived for only a brief time thereafter, while his sister throve and lived on, differing in no wise from the girls of her own country. The story goeth that she later married a man at King's Lynn, Norfolk, where she is still said to be living, or so it was said, up to a few years ago. These two strange children are often asked whence they came, and replied, "We are folk of St. Martin's land, for he is the chief saint amongst us. We know not where the land is, and remember only that one day we were feeding our father's flock in the field, when we heard a great noise like bells, as when at St. Edmunds they all peal together, and suddenly we were wrapped up in the spirit and found ourselves in your harvest field. Among us no sun riseth, nor is there open sunshine, but such a twilight as here goes before the rising and setting of the sun. Yet a land of light is to be seen not far from us, but severed from us by a stream of great breadth." That concludes Gervase of Tilbury's account of the green children reproduced from Wilkins' book. The remarks in brackets in the story are made by Mr. Wilkins. Incidentally, Gervase of Tilbury lived around the late 12th and early 13th centuries. Wilkins commented on the Gervase's account as follows: "It is difficult at this stretch of time to estimate on what basis of fact this story may rest. Obviously, a certain amount of Catholic hagiology has been imported into it." Then, in a footnote, Wilkins wrote, "St. Martin's land is probably Merlin's land of Grammari, or necromancy, a subterranean world, or twilight land, to which the gods or godmen were forced to descend after the submersion of Greater Atlantis. Hints of it are found in Amerindian myths and folklore, from Patagonia to Alaska, and there are obscure references to it in the tradition told to Agede, the missionary, by Greenlanders who said that the first Greenlander came out of a subterranean world. The American soldier, John Cleave Science, actually petitioned both houses of a derisive Congress to grant him a ship in 1823 to find the North Polar opening to an inner sphere, or underground world, which was warm and fertile, and well stocked with fruits and vegetables. Before merely dismissing Symes as a madman, as did Lecomte de Volney of the Académie des Sciences at Paris in 1822, let it be recalled that no one has cleared up the mystery of the marked reindeer with clipped ears shot in desolate Spitsbergen in 1876. The first statement on this point was made in 1705 by Nicolaas Whitson, a Dutchman, in his Noordoosten gedeelte van Asia en Europa. He says that reindeer, far remote from many in Norway who are well acquainted with the care of reindeer, state positively that, in and before AD 1700, they had shot reindeer in Spitsbergen, totally uninhabited, clipped in the ears. These Spitsbergen reindeer are smaller and plumper than other Arctic breeds. One would like also to know more about these wolf pits at Woolpit, Suffolk, and whether there exist deep caves or subterraneans in this part of Suffolk. Santa wouldn't be happy with that. Deros and Teros. A book about a possible hollow earth and its inhabitants cannot be written without some space being given to the claims of Richard S. Shaver. On 21st of May 1951, Life magazine printed 8 pages of material on the Shaver story. The reader response was overwhelming, and the feature created more interest than any other articles Life had published up to that time. The Shaver stories were originally published by Ray Palmer in Amazing Stories magazine in 1944, and the series ran for 4 years. Thousands of readers wrote in asserting that they were true, regardless of the fact that Palmer had published them as science fiction. Shaver maintains that the stories are factual and claims to have been inside the interior of the Earth. Palmer, reporting on the Shaver story, wrote, "Briefly, what Mr. Shaver says is this. The Earth is inhabited underground in gigantic caves whose area is a great deal more than the surface land area by a race of people called by him Abandonero, or descendants of an abandoned group of people who were unable to leave the planet some 12,000 or more years ago, in a general exodus made necessary by the discovery that the sun had commenced to hurl death-dealing radiations over the entire planet." Shaver states that there are two groups of people in the caves. He terms them the Darrow and the Terro. The Darrow have degenerated into midget-like idiots. On the other hand, the Terro have managed to maintain a higher mental state. Palmer added, "However, down the centuries, the Darrow have become more numerous and the Terro reduced by constant attack to a few scattered groups in hiding who are unable to circumvent the devilry of the Darrow. The Darrow have access to the wonderful machines of the ancients still in working order, since they were built almost indestructible. And with these machines they are able to bedevil both the Terro and the surface people. Among these machines are marvellous vision rays that can penetrate miles of solid rock, picking up scenes all over the Earth without the need of a broadcast unit. Transportation by teleportation instantaneously from one point to another, although this did require a sending and receiving set. Mental machines which cause seemingly solid illusions, dreams, hypnotic compulsions, which account for the strange urges to kill of surface folk, such as the case of the young girl who said, 'God told me to stab mother with a knife.' They have death rays, spaceships, giant rockets that traverse the upper air. The flying saucers were described in detail by Mr. Shaver before they actually appeared to Mr. Kenneth Arnold and to thousands since. Ground vehicles of tremendous power, machines in the revitalising of sex known as stim machines, in which these degenerates sometimes spend their whole lives in a sexual debauch that actually deforms their bodies in horrible ways almost beyond mentioning. Ben rays, which heal and restore the body, but are also capable of restoring lost energy after a debauch, and many more marvellous things which Mr. Shaver claims would revolutionise our surface science if we could but obtain them. Today, says Mr. Shaver, the Darrows still exist in the caves and all our troubles are caused by them. Our wars are fostered by them. Our terrible air accidents are not always accidents at all, but the result of destructive rays aimed at them by the idiots whose only delight is death and torture. Even our nightmares are the result of their dream mech trained on us in our sleep." That is a very brief resume of the Shaver saga. Thousands of people have written about Life magazine and its Ray Palmer, the original publisher, confirming that the stories are true. Over a century ago, the famous French novelist Jules Verne wrote a most exciting book called Journey to the Centre of the Earth. This was originally published in France during 1864. Jules Verne was a very imaginative storyteller and could be called one of the first science fiction writers. He wrote many other successful books in that vein, but this particular one had a tremendous vogue. It caught the imagination of the public in a big way, just as Tolkien's books were to do in this day and age. The book is absolutely fascinating in the light of what has been discussed in these pages. It has often been said that science fiction writers have an uncanny... This is very true. Verne's story was really fantastic. It was about a scientist who found an opening leading down into the centre of the Earth. A whole group of people, including a Nordic farmer with his goose called Gertrude, made their way down through wonderful caverns covered in radiant crystals. The most remarkable book was written some years ago called The Smoky God by Willis George Emerson. It describes the amazing experiences of a Norwegian, Olaf Jansen. Mr. Emerson became friendly with the Old Norseman in Southern California just prior to the latter's death. The old man gave Emerson some maps and papers and told him a fantastic story. Jansen and his father were fishermen. On one of their trips they sailed farther north than ever before and eventually found themselves inside the Earth. They met up with some friendly giants who extended hospitality to them. Jansen and his father were shown many marvellous things. Eventually they sailed on a river right through the interior of the Earth and emerged somewhere in Antarctica. Unfortunately, shortly afterwards, their boat hit an iceberg. Jansen's father was drowned and their ship lost. Jansen, clinging precariously to the iceberg, was picked up by a Scottish whaler. When he told his tale to the captain, the poor chap was put in irons and regarded as mentally deranged. The ship duly docked at Stockholm, and Jansen was committed to a mental asylum where he spent the next 28 years of his life. The book is named after the dull red sun surrounded by white vapour inside the earth. This is interesting, as Marshall B. Gardner postulated that all planets are hollow and have central suns. Whether you believe Olaf Jansen's story or not, it is a splendidly exciting one. Emerson wrote the tale as fiction because it was difficult to put over as fact. It is possible that some long-forgotten memory of the inner earth still persists in the subconscious minds of people today. Consider the tremendous impact of the late Professor J.R.R. Tolkien's book, The Lord of the Rings, about Middle-earth. He was a wonderful writer and told a spellbinding tale. His stories remind us of the old Arthurian tales in one sense. The main theme of Tolkien's stories is the constant duel between the forces of good and evil. Shaver, in his tales of Deros and Teros, is really discussing the same eternal theme. The Tolkien books have probably sold millions of copies. Indeed, a whole cult has grown up around them. Professor Tolkien discounted any idea of there having any basis in fact, and stated that they were just stories. Nevertheless, the impact on readers has been traumatic. This all ties in to some considerable extent with all the people being buried in the subconscious mind of humanity that reacts to both Shaver's claims and to Tolkien's magnificent stories. Chapter 22. We're getting through it. Are we being put off the track? Over the last few years, many ufologists, including myself, have come around to the view that most of the UFO activity emanated from an invisible area impenetrating our planet, rather than from the old, widely accepted extraterrestrial point of origin. This viewpoint came about to some extent through the ability of both the UFOs and the UFO-nauts to materialise and dematerialise and perform many other feats, pointing to the probability that they emerged into our plane of existence from another order of matter, that is, from an invisible realm. In my last book, The Eternal Subject, there's a section devoted to showing a possible connection between UFOs and psychic phenomena. It is more than possible that UFO entities manipulate a good deal of psychic phenomena. Many ufologists consider that the UFO-nauts pretend to come from Mars, Venus, Jupiter, and all stopover points out in space, so as to confuse us and not disclose their real place of residence. It is just possible that they materialise and dematerialise, teleport people and bring out poltergeist activity for the same reason. In short, to confuse us still further and put into our minds the idea of an invisible realm as their inhabitant. After all, Mr. Shaver may be right. He has told us that the Darrow can do all these amazing feats. Once again, perhaps we are being put off track. The answer may lie literally beneath our feet. If a race of people are living in the interior of the Earth, then they would have been resident there for at least 12,000 years. Furthermore, it's true that inner Earth people have the use of wonderful machines, flying saucers, and the old Atlantean magical powers, then they may well possess their extrasensory abilities to be able to manipulate psychic phenomena, besides performing all the wonders mentioned earlier. The well-known American writer on UFOs, John A. Keel, discussing non-psychic UFO phenomena in an article published in Saga magazine, wrote, "There is, however, a mountain of evidence indicating that the force behind the UFO phenomenon is solidly based on this planet, and it has been conning us for years to keep us from discovering this fact." It should be made clear that Keel was not advocating a hollow Earth in his article, pointing to our planet as a base for UFOs. So again, if it's an infinite planar Earth, and they come from beyond Antarctica, hello. However, he is getting warm. It is more than possible that they do have a base on the surface, but that is not their point of origin. The UFO-nauts have been leading us a pretty dance for a very long time. According to Keel, they've been dropping artifacts all over the place for years. However, the important point is that they have deposited on our soil a very earthly substances, such as aluminium, silicon, magnesium, and calcium. These particularly earthly substances, as Keel points out, are ignored by most ufologists looking for artefacts of an out-of-this-world nature. Keel put it in these words: "A far more bitter truth is the sobering fact that the UFO enthusiasts and their organisations have overlooked a mountain of evidence themselves, often suppressing such evidence because it doesn't conform with their dogged belief in extraterrestrial visitations. If they systematically collected all the physical materials dropped from flying saucers in the past 25 years, they would now have their own warehouse full of proof." Keel cited many examples of earthly substances being dropped by UFOs, and for this reason the US Air Force wrote many alleged landings off as hoaxes. In his article, Keel mentioned a landing at Glasborough, New Jersey, back in 1964. Apparently, a small amount of potassium nitrate was found at the site, so the Air Force considered the whole affair a human hoax, even though there were markings on the ground identical with those at other landing sites. Keel quoted case after case of UFOs landing and dropping earthly substances, chiefly in the form of chemicals. For example, thousands of miles away on 27th of October 1954, a formation of glowing objects appeared over a crowded football stadium in Florence, Italy. A shower of shining flakes fell on the crowd from the sky. When these were analysed by the Chemical Institute of the University of Milan, they were found to be composed of magnesium, iron, silicon and calcium. Silicon is one of the most common substances. Silica is an ordinary sand. Heat it and then cool it and you have glass. Silicon can be made in all kinds of plastic objects. An almost endless variety of silicic objects and substances have been found at UFO landing sites during the past 25 years. It most often appears as a purplish liquid which resembles ordinary fuel oil. Indeed, it is sometimes mistaken for oil. When a fertilizer salesman named Reinhold Schmidt reported seeing a UFO land near Kearney, Nebraska in 1957, investigating police officers found a puddle of this fluid at the site and accused Schmidt of putting it there himself. Another outstanding case took place on 19th of August 1965 on a farm outside Cherry Creek, New York. Howard Butcher, 16, was milking cows at 8:20 p.m. when the portable radio in the barn was suddenly drowned out by static and the tractor running the milking machine abruptly stopped. Outside, a Holstein bull chained to a steel bar by a ring through its nose began to bellow. Young Butcher ran to the window and looked out. He saw a large egg-shaped object trailing a reddish vapour and emitting a steady beep-beep sound as it touched down in a nearby field. A few moments later, it flew away, Butcher said, leaving behind a strange smell and several globs of a shimmering purplish liquid. The Kawaki Chemical Company later performed a chemical analysis and found that the liquid was composed of silicon, aluminium and iron. I could give you many more examples of Keel's informative article, but there's a saying, enough is as good as a feast. Subsequently, Keel went on to state, "Unfortunately, after all these years of research, study and investigation by thousands of people and scores of scientists operating outside the Air Force and government, there's still no evidence to back up the notion that flying saucers come from outer space. There is, on the other hand, considerable evidence that real UFOs are of earthly manufacture and are piloted by normal human beings, excluding those landings and contacts which seem more in the nature of psychic phenomena. What's more, there is evidence that persons who dress and look like us, and probably are Earthlings, are often engaged in collecting UFO artefacts, arriving on the scene before the original witnesses have had a chance to tell anybody about what they have seen." Very often, Keel stated, these foreign-looking men search the site. He quoted many modern examples of this strange activity, but also gave an example from shortly after the turn of the century. This incident was reported in the London Daily Mail of 20th of May 1909, and the news story told of a clerk who had seen 5 foreigners at a landing site in Wales taking measurements and photographs. Who are these mysterious foreign-looking men that turn up so quickly on these occasions? Obviously not CIA agents. That agency was not formed until after the attack on Pearl Harbor in the last World War. Mention is made of the CIA because they've been accused of being involved with the UFO situation on many occasions. No doubt they are involved to some extent, but only if physical objects invading American airspace become a national security problem. I suggest that these foreign-looking men are much more likely to be very closely associated with the UFO nauts. We'll be going into this interesting aspect of the problem later on. Now, let us pause for a moment and consider all the foregoing means. If, as Keel says, the UFOs are piloted by Earthlings, then those craft could not have been manufactured on the Earth's surface by any country. You just couldn't keep flying top secret, flying saucers all over the world for 25 years without someone spilling the beans. The fact that the UFO noughts look like ourselves and have been dropping earthly substances indicates that they come from the Earth. However, if these craft are not manufactured on the surface, then they must come from within the Earth. It is as simple as that. The quotations from John Keel's article, The UFO Evidence Everyone Ignores, are from Saga magazine, copyright 73 by Gamby Publications. Well, there you go. As I suggested, this author is suggesting that they come from inside the Earth. Well, if we consider the fact that we are at the very bottom of the universe, a stationary plane, it kind of makes sense that it could well be infinite, and that there are other solar systems with their worlds of stars going around them, beyond Antarctica. Antarctica being a great ice ring around our known world. This is our prison system. We are like the very centre, hence the magnetic centre. But hey, what if there are multiple, infinite continents beyond that? It stands to reason it's possible. And so that what the author is suggesting is it's not necessarily from the interior of the Earth, but from beyond the poles, as Bird mentioned. Chapter 23, They Knew Too Much. I think I might need a port for this. It's always good to come into port. Holy shit, that's a double port. Oh, hang on, no, it's not. A port is 60 mil. That's only 61 mil. Ah, there we go. Shall we carry on? They knew too much. One of the stranger aspects of the flying saucer phenomena is the silencing of well-known ufologists by the mysterious Man in Black. I had a feeling it was going to come to this. I haven't read this book in years, so I nearly mentioned Men in Black, what he was saying there. Now the author is right into it. Men in Black. Have a look for yourself. Okay. The first known Man in Black case in modern times was the Maury Island affair in 1947. The late Edward J. Ruppelt, former head of the United States Air Force Project Blue Book, stated in his book, through report on unidentified flying objects, that the two principals in the case, Harold A. Dahl and Fred L. Crisman, had confessed to perpetrating a hoax. The result was that the Air Force took no further interest in the matter. The only people hoaxed were the Air Force, including two military intelligence officers who lost their lives on their way back from Tacoma to California. Let us recapitulate what happened at lonely Maury Island on 21st June 1947, 3 days before Kenneth Arnold's sightings, which triggered off press publicity in a big wave for flying saucers. Harold A. Dahl, a Harvard patrolman, was out in his boat on the east bay of Maury Island near Tacoma, state of Washington, with a crew of 2 men and his son. Dahl's dog was also in the boat. Suddenly Dahl, who was also at the wheel, noticed 6 very large donut-shaped aircraft. I would judge that they were about 2,000 feet above water and almost directly overhead. At first glance I thought them to be balloons, as they seemed to be stationary. Under observation, 5 of these strange aircraft were circling very slowly around the 6th one, which was stationary in the centre of the formation. It appeared to me that the centre aircraft was in some kind of trouble, as it was losing altitude fairly rapidly. The other aircraft stayed at a distance of about 200 feet above the centre one, as if they were following the centre one down. The centre aircraft came to rest almost directly overhead at about 500 feet above the water. All on board our boat were watching these aircraft with a great deal of interest, as they apparently had no motors, propellers, or any kinds of visible signs of propulsion, and to the best of our hearing they made no sound. In describing the aircraft, I would say they were at least 100 feet in diameter. Each had a hole in the centre, approximately 25 feet in diameter. They were all a sort of shell-like gold and silver colour. Their surface seemed of metal and appeared to be boiled, because when the light shone on them, through the clouds they were brilliant. Not all one brilliance, but many brilliances, something like a Buick dashboard. Dahl had managed to manoeuvre his boat close into he was able to take some photographs of the objects. Suddenly there was a dull boom and the centre object disgorged a large quantity of white, light metal pieces. This was followed by what seemed to Dahl and his companions a hail of blacker metal, which had a similar appearance to lava rock. Dahl's son had his arm injured by one of the falling fragments and another piece killed his dog. The pieces appeared to be hot, for when they hit the bay, steam rose from the water. When this extraordinary deluge of metal ceased, all 6 of the aircraft rose and drifted out to sea. The centre object, which had dropped the metal, did not seem in any way disturbed and remained in the centre as the group moved away. Dahl stated that his boat had been damaged by the falling fragments. The crew managed to return it to Tacoma, where Dahl reported the incident to Fred L. Crisman, his immediate chief. The latter thought Dahl and the others had been on a drinking spree. He did not at first believe their story. However, Dahl gave Crisman his camera and its load of film and some of the pieces of metal as proof, according to Dahl. The film from our camera developed showed these strange aircraft, but the negatives were covered with spots similar to a negative that has been close to an X-ray room before being exposed, except that the spots printed white instead of black, as is the usual case. Early in the next morning, something strange happened to Dahl. One of those rather frightening things that come the way of people who know too much about certain aspects of flying saucers. A man, dressed in black, called at his home and invited him out to breakfast. Dahl was used to lumber buyers calling on him early and at first thought there was nothing unusual about his visitor. That is until, over the breakfast table, the man described in full detail everything that had occurred the day before. It was quite uncanny. The man in black told Dahl that if he valued his own welfare and that of his family, he should not discuss his experiences with anyone. Earlier that morning, too, Crisman went over to Maury Island and found all the debris exactly as Dahl had reported. Then, according to Crisman, while I stood looking at the fragments, holding a few pieces in my hand, one of the same kind of aircraft that Harold described to me came right out of a large, fat cumulus cloud and made a wide circle of the little bay. All these events were related to Kenneth Arnold, the man who saw 9 gleaming objects flying near Mount Rainier, state of Washington, 3 days after Dahl's encounter with 6 donut-shaped ones at Maury Island. Arnold had flown to Tacoma to investigate the affair at the request of Ray Palmer. He sent for Captain E.J. Smith, a United Airlines pilot, to come and join him. Captain Smith had also seen a gaggle of saucers from his airliner soon after Arnold's own sighting. The 2 pilots continued the investigation together from the Winthrop Hotel in Tacoma. After a while, they decided to bring in 2 intelligence officers from Hamilton Air Force Base, Captain William Davidson and Lieutenant Frank Brown, for their capabilities. Dahl and Crisman were both agreeable to this step, but the strange affair took on a new slant when the intelligence officers arrived at the Winthrop Hotel. Dahl and Crisman gave the impression of making the whole business appear a hoax. Davidson and Brown suddenly threw in their hands and decided to fly back to California in their B-25 bomber. Just before the 2 officers left, Crisman drove up in a great hurry with a load of fragments. These were transferred to the intelligence officer's vehicle and went with them to be eventually loaded onto the bomber. Half an hour after takeoff, the B-25 crashed near Kelso, Washington. Davidson and Brown were both killed. Subsequently, another intelligence officer, a Major Sanders, interviewed both Arnold and Smith in Tacoma. Later, he took them both in his car to the beach at Maury Island and pronounced the fragments alleged to have fallen there as nothing but ordinary slag. Nevertheless, he made sure of taking away with him all the pieces that Arnold had at the hotel for analysis. Those are the main facts of this fantastic case. Let us look at 1 or 2 points. First, Dahl's description of the objects as aircraft. The point is that he described the objects as donut-shaped. Now, this is very important, and it is on this description that possibly the whole matter hinges. Neither Arnold nor Smith described their objects as donut-shaped. They were discs, though I understand that Arnold's were more crescent-shaped. Since 1947, the bulk of the sightings have been disc or saucer-shaped objects, although there have been plenty of other shapes thrown in for good measure: triangular, star, oval, tadpole, delta, and cigar-shaped, among others. Donut-shaped objects have been rare, but they have been seen and photographed. The point is that from Arnold's sighting onward, for a very long time, those who reported seeing what are termed flying saucers did not report donut-shaped ones. Therefore, if Dahl and Crisman were concocting a hoax, quite apart from subsequently making it appear to be one, why did they pick on donuts? If you or I were going to perpetrate a flying saucer hoax at that time, and the time is so important, would we pick on such a shape? It has to be doubted. Or it is to be doubted. Furthermore, if you or I did, by such long odds, pick on donuts for our hoax on 21st of June 1947, we would think it incredible that a donut-shaped UFO was photographed over New York City almost 8 years later and was identical in size and characteristics. On Sunday, 15th of May 1955, Warren Sigmund saw for a period of about 1 minute and a half an unidentified flying object over Union Square, New York City. This important sighting was fully described in Flying Saucer Review. It was a beautiful day, and so, quite naturally, Mr. Sigmund was taking some pictures on the roof of the office building with a small reflex-type camera of Miss Janine Boulier, who worked for the French government tourist office. Suddenly, Miss Boulier pointed at the sky behind her friend, exclaiming, "Quick, take a look at that!" Mr. Sigmund turned and looked in the direction she had indicated. He saw an enormous circular object, radiating like an immense ball of fire. Sigmund said he had never seen anything like it before in his life. It was a tremendous size. He started taking pictures. The object had no wings, no tail, and no markings. It made no sound. Quote, "It didn't seem to know what gravity was. If it did know, it certainly wasn't respecting it," unquote, Sigmund declared. He managed to get several photographs of the object, one of which clearly showed its donut shape. The World Telegram broke the news of this sighting with a big front-page story. The telephoto service of the United Press sent the photographs to every part of the world. Mr. Sigmund showed the pictures to the United States Air Force Office of Special Investigations. They examined the negatives and agreed that he had seen something. An extremely well-authenticated sighting of a donut-shaped object on 21st of September 1961. Two Boeing 707s encountered a large UFO over the Pacific. One was a BOAC aircraft with Captain R.F. Griffin in command, and the other was Pan American airliner. Both captains radioed to FAA towers at Wake Island and Honolulu reports of the enormous object they had seen. Captain Griffin's BOAC airliner was flying at 37,000 feet when the UFO showed up. Suddenly we saw this bright ring in the sky about 50 degrees up. He described the object as round with clearly defined edges and pointed out that it had a very clear hole in the centre. The Pan American skipper confirmed Captain Griffin's report. Captain Griffin added that the UFO was travelling in their direction but at a much greater speed and that it went over the horizon in 7 minutes. The object must have been enormous to have been in such detail at such an altitude. Surely these two remarkable sightings of donut-shaped UFOs over New York in 1955 and over the Pacific in 1961 go a long way to establishing that the Maury Island affair was no hoax. The all-important question is repeated. If Dahl was carrying out a hoax, is it likely that he would have picked on donut-shaped saucers at that time? Remember, flying saucers were only just beginning to get publicity, and no donut ones had been seen prior to Dahl's sighting. Incidentally, another point that may not have impressed the intelligence is that the UFOs are in the habit of dropping earthly substances on the surface of our planet. Times have changed. This is something that has been learnt over the years. The fact that slag was alleged to have been dropped from the centre of a UFO was probably an insult to the intelligence of the two officers. In 1947, if you're going to perpetrate a hoax connected with flying saucers, slag would have been the last thing to include in your plans. Therefore, the dropping of the slag, in the light of what is known now, is another very important factor in favour of Dahl and Crisman. The Maury Island affair was no hoax. The intriguing question as to why Dahl and Crisman, when confronted with Davidson and Brown, appeared to make the whole affair at Maury Island out to be a hoax is, indeed, quite another matter. Perhaps the gentleman in a black suit who invited Dahl out to breakfast connected to that one. Can we assume for a moment that a hollow earth exists and that people do live inside in the past 25 years or more fit into place? Veteran ufologists will recall the sensational closing down of Albert K. Bender's Veteran ufologists recall the sensational closing down of Albert K. International Flying Saucer Bureau back in 1953. I nearly called my son Albert, just as a little side note here, and I was going to give him my first name as his middle name, so he'd be a albatross. I didn't, of course. I gave him my middle name, and he's a Jack Edward. Anyway, on we go. Bender's International Flying Saucer Bureau back in 1953. At that time, Bender had quite a large international movement. He had been in close touch with Edgar Jarrald, another ufologist who headed the Australian Flying Saucer Bureau, and they had been working together on a theory linking the UFOs with Antarctica. Mr. Bender had written an article for publication in his magazine which divulged the secret of the saucers. That article was never published. 3 men in black visited Bender at his home. They so frightened Bender that for a long time he gave up all UFO research. This incident has been fully described by Gray Barker in his book, They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers. Bender's colleagues questioned him afterwards for some time, and with his permission tape recorded his answers. One of the questions put to him was, "How did you find out about it? Can't you tell me just where you got your theory?" Bender's answer was, "All I can say is this. He came up with the answer." And for those who question me when I talk about how the moon came about, I've done a similar sort of thing. This has taken me many years of pondering how did the moon come about, and I didn't just pull it out of thin air necessarily. That after great consideration, after careful observation of the natural way of the world and the natural ways of the moon, that is how I came up to my conclusion that the moon was mined from earthly material, and the most likely source for such an massive amount of mass would have come from a place that we now call the Grand Canyon. And to suspend such a bauble in space would require an awful lot of either helium-3, as it's called, or perhaps hydrogen. Anyway, I'll go back to reading the book again. Now, that answer is very significant. An extraterrestrial origin for the sources would not be in the fantastic for a UFO researcher. What would be in the realm of the fantastic would be an inner Earth concept. It is also noted that both Bender and Jarrald were working on a theory to do with Antarctica. You will get my message. If it is also noted that both Bender and Jarrald were working on a theory to do with Antarctica, you will get my message. If it is also noted that both Bender and Jarrald were working on a theory to do with Antarctica, you will get my message. If it can be tentatively accepted that such an inner world exists, or outer world, south, outside. If it can be tentatively accepted that such an inner world exists, and proof has been presented in the second part of this book, and that the occupants have the use of fantastic machines as well as extrasensory powers, then it is too easy for them to frighten people into silence. If they look like us to a great extent, then they probably have their representatives here on the surface who may be the men in black, living just below us inside the earth with all their wonderful machines and advanced knowledge. It would be only too easy for them to monitor our languages, and they probably know more about us than we do ourselves. Therefore, as I have written, it would be easy to frighten people into silence if they wanted to do so. After all, ufologists have wives and families, and how many police officers are going to believe statements that UFO researchers are being threatened by denizens of the inner world? In any case, the police have a full-time job coping with crimes committed by members of another underworld. Consider the case of late Dr. Morris K. Jessup, a professional astronomer. He was also a prominent ufologist and wrote several fine books on the subject. Jessup believed that the majority of the UFOs emanated from what he called the binary Earth-Moon system. He considered the UFOs came from installations inside the interior of the moon and from inside the Earth, and that they had bases in the oceans too. I think that this latter point is also very valid. In the introduction of this book, I referred to the work by the late Ivan T. Sanderson called Invisible Residents. He produced a massive evidence pointing to the fact that many of the UFOs had been seen to dive in and out of the oceans, and postulated that they probably had bases there. As I write these words, I'm thinking of several American newspaper cuttings that have landed up on my desk from correspondents in the United States in the last few days. One of those periodical UFO flaps is in progress, but several of the news stories relate to something that would have been right up Sanderson's street if he had been still with us today. We sorely miss him, a very fine man. Here's the account, straight from the Boston Herald American, dated Saturday, 13th of October, 1973. These were... I can't even read now. There were these strange creatures. I think it's beer o'clock. Oh. There were these strange creatures. Pascagoula, Mississippi, whatever. Two shipyard workers who claimed they were hauled aboard a UFO and examined by silvery-skinned creatures with big eyes and pointed ears were checked at a military hospital yesterday and found to be clear of radiation. Air Force doctors at nearby Keesler Air Force Base examined the men, Charles Hickson, 42, and Calvin Parker, 19, as a precautionary measure after they came forth with their weird tale. Officials said the men, both employed at Walker Shipyards, where Hickson is a foreman, would make no further public statements concerning their story until they talked further with federal authorities. Jackson County Chief Deputy Barney Mathis said the men told him that they were fishing from an old pier on the west bank of Pascagoula River about 7 p.m. Thursday when they noticed a strange craft about 2 miles away emitting a bluish haze. They said it moved closer and then appeared to hover about 3 or 4 feet above the water. Then 3 whatever they were came out, either floating or walking, and carried us into the ship. Officers quoted Hickson as saying, "The things had big eyes. They kept us about 20 minutes, photographed us, and then took us back to the pier. The only sound they made was a buzzing, humming sound they left in a flash." "These are reliable people," Sheriff Fred Diamond said. "They had no reason to say this if it had not been true. I know something did happen to them." The sheriff said the spacecraft was described as fish-shaped, about 10 square feet with an 8-foot ceiling. The occupants were said to have pale silvery grey skin, no hair, long pointed ears, and noses with an opening for a mouth and hands like crab-like claws. Subsequently, the 2 men were interviewed by Dr. J. Allen Hynek, who is a professor of astronomy at Northwestern University and was civilian consultant to the former US Air Force Project Blue Book investigating UFOs, and also by Dr. Harder of California. Hynek stated after examining the men under hypnosis that he found them telling the truth beyond a reasonable doubt. It seems more than likely that there are some UFOs that have bases under the seas, as both Sanderson and Jessup thought. On 20th of April 1959, Dr. Morris J. Kessler was found dead. He'd apparently committed suicide by inhaling carbon monoxide, presumably by connecting a hose to the exhaust of his station wagon and introducing it inside the vehicle. Did Jessup know too much? A very prominent scientist and leading ufologist was the late Dr. James E. McDonald, senior physicist, Institute of Atmospheric Physics and Professor, Department of Meteorology, University of Arizona. Dr. McDonald became a very outstanding speaker and writer on UFOs and was very critical of the US Air Force's handling of the UFO situation. Keel wrote that Dr. McDonald privately discussed in his last years the possibility that alien beings were not only present on this planet but were systematically taking over the top posts in government and military. On 13th of June 1971, his body was found in the desert north of Tucson, Arizona. He too had apparently done away with himself. Did McDonald know too much? Then there is the case of Professor Rene Hardy. He was a scientist of world repute, a prodigious inventor with over 250 patents in his name in the fields of electronics, radio, television, ultrasonics and optics. He was interested in ufology, parapsychology and interstellar navigation, among many other subjects. On 12th June 1972, The professor was found dead with a bullet in his head and a revolver in his hand, just 2 days before he was to announce the highly important discovery concerning space phenomena. There was no reason for his apparent suicide. There followed a most extraordinary and significant happening. At the funeral of Professor Hardy, there were 6 tall men that no one knew, and although photographs were taken of all present, those 6 men did not appear in the printed photographs. The suicides of Jessup, MacDonald and Hardy may all have been perfectly genuine ones for personal reasons. However, it is certainly strange that 3 people, all of whom had played a leading part in ufology, should have left us in this most unfortunate manner. It would seem that they knew too much about flying saucers. With apologies to Gray Barker. I think that says more than needs to be said. What about all these people who are anti-vaxxers? I might even take a very brief note to show you what 3 healthy, beautiful young children look like who have never been vaccinated a day in their lives. Just right here. Yo, what's going on? Here's a picture of one such beautiful young character, 6 years of age, never been vaccinated, apart from what the doctors enforced upon her, because we had no choice. And here are my beautiful young children. My eldest had a couple of vaccinations. That is true. But look how healthy, happy, and beautiful they are. 6, 8, and 9, I would imagine, was approximately their ages. Beautiful, healthy, happy children. Never needed vaccinations. Here is the little 6-year-old girl. Her first day of school. Most kids are terrified of school on their first day. Have a look at this. Does this little girl look terrified to you? Nah. Happy, healthy, beautiful, unvaccinated, mostly vegan. We did eat, and still do eat chicken and fish, but she is now 18 years old, has just done her first year of a science degree, on her way to become a veterinarian, has chosen to become vegan herself some 4 or 5 years ago. No vaccinations required. Happy, healthy, beautiful, thriving, as it should be. And I guess I got one more just to show you real quickly. That's also her first day at school. It's yours truly, showing in the picture there, with her mother. Happy, healthy, thriving children. No vaccinations required. You look at people who are vaccinated, full of disease. I shall carry on. In fact, you can go without me for a moment because I don't think I can pause a live video. I will be right back. I think it's just time to get a fresh beer. See you in a second. Alright, sorry about that little brief interlude, but you know, sometimes you gotta do what you gotta do. Alright, so I'll just jump straight back into reading as soon as I pop this little popper. Oh yeah. That one was only bottled on Christmas Day, so it's fresh. Okay, humming sounds from underground, chapter 24. During the past 2 decades, strange humming noises, which seem to those to have heard them to be coming from underground, have been reported from different parts of the country. These unexplained, this is in 1974, mind you. These unexplained noises were heard about 20 years ago at Leigh-on-Sea, Essex, and also at Chalfont St Gillies in Buckinghamshire. In more recent years, the humming has been heard in the London area, down in Kent, and in Bournemouth. The persistent humming at Chalfont St Giles began in September 1953, but by the end of the year the noise, which had a deep vibration, was becoming very loud. Some people, unable to get any sleep and lay awake listening to the constant humming, which at times increased in intensity. Harold T. Wilkins, in his book Flying Saucers Uncensored, mentions an unnamed correspondent who wrote him of information he had got from a lady in the neighbourhood, worried by the strange underground noises